Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The summer air in New York hangs heavy, thick with the exhaust of idling cars and the low hum of a city that never truly sleeps. It is the late 1980s, and in certain corners of Brooklyn and Staten Island, the fear is almost physical. Drug dealers vanish without a trace. Rival gang members disappear after routine meetings. Word leaks through hushed conversations in holding cells and smoky back rooms. Someone out there is hunting people with a precision the streets have rarely seen. Detectives follow whispers instead of witnesses, tracking rumors of a man who moves with the control of a trained fighter and the secrecy of a professional spy. His name surfaces again and again in informant debriefings, usually spoken quietly, often with visible unease. Tommy Karate. To law enforcement, he is a puzzle that suggests something new and deeply unsettling, a hybrid of old-world organized crime and a modern, almost surgical approach to violence. To understand how a boy from Brooklyn could grow into the kind of figure prosecutors would later call one of the most dangerous enforcers of his era, we have to step far away from the interrogation rooms and federal courtrooms. We have to go back to the streets where he learned to walk, to a city that was changing as rapidly as he was, and to a childhood shaped by illness, isolation, and a fascination with the idea that the body and mind could be turned into weapons long before he ever met a single made man. Thomas Pitera was born on December 10, 1954, in Brooklyn, New York, into a working-class Italian-American family. Post-war Brooklyn was a place of close-knit neighborhoods where extended families often lived only blocks apart. Grocery stores, parishes, and schoolyards overlapped to form a kind of protective cocoon, especially in Italian enclaves. At first glance, his early world looked like a modest success story of immigrant America. Parents who worked, kids who played stickball in the streets, grandparents who insisted on Sunday dinners. Yet just below that surface was another reality, one that would become pivotal to his life. In the same neighborhoods where children walked to Catholic school, certain corner social clubs were quietly controlled by men whose power didn't come from City Hall or the police department, but from their connections to New York's 5 families. As a small child, Thomas was not the image of the tough Brooklyn kid that older generations romanticized. Reports from people who knew him as a boy describe him as frail and frequently ill. He suffered from chronic health issues, including respiratory problems that left him short of breath, and often confined indoors when other children were playing. He was undersized, thin, and wore thick glasses that made him stand out in a culture that valued toughness and athleticism. At school, this could be a dangerous combination. Teasing came easily to other children. Bullying was common in the corridors and on the walk home. For a boy struggling to breathe, to keep up, to blend in, these early experiences etched deep feelings of vulnerability and resentment. The Brooklyn of his youth was also the Brooklyn of the early 1960s, a moment when television was pouring new images into American living rooms. Cowboys, detectives, war heroes, and eventually martial artists flickered on black and white screens. For a sickly boy who felt powerless outside, the worlds on television offered something else entirely. A controlled universe where discipline, skill, and inner focus could turn a small or underestimated person into someone others feared or respected. According to later accounts, Thomas was captivated by these representations of physical mastery. Films featuring Asian martial artists and later television shows centered around wandering fighters struck a particular chord. They suggested that through relentless practice, a person could transform their body into a shield and their hands into precise instruments of control. Around the age of 12, Thomas discovered martial arts not just as entertainment, but as a tangible escape route from the role he had been assigned by his body and his peers. Brooklyn was beginning to see a wave of Eastern fighting schools as karate and other disciplines slowly gained popularity in the United States. Modest storefront dojos opened in commercial strips that had once housed tailors or small groceries. Inside, there were no schoolyard cliques, no older kids shoving the younger ones against lockers. There were mats, uniforms, and strict hierarchies based on skill and effort, not on size or social status. For a boy who had felt powerless, the appeal was immediate and intense. He joined a local dojo and immersed himself in training with a seriousness that surprised even his instructors. Where other children might attend a few classes a week, Thomas devoted long hours to practice, repeating movements endlessly until they were etched into his muscle memory. He studied forms, stances, and strikes. He learned how to generate power not from brute strength but from precision and leverage. Within the controlled environment of the dojo, his physical limitations became less important than his focus and determination. For the first time in his life, he felt he had discovered a place where the rules worked in his favor. Outside, however, Brooklyn was moving in a darker direction. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw rising crime, a growing drug trade, and urban decay. Many working-class neighborhoods began to fray at the edges as jobs disappeared and city services diminished. In the Italian-American enclaves that housed traditional organized crime, the local mob families were both a stabilizing and corrosive force. They were reputed to solve disputes faster than the police, to make sure that random street crime did not target their blocks. But they were also expanding into new rackets, including narcotics, and internal power struggles were starting to heat up. Young people in these neighborhoods grew up seeing well-dressed men with gold jewelry and new cars posted outside nondescript clubs. Everyone knew, at least in general terms, who they were. For Thomas, these men were part of the background rather than the foreground of his teenage years, but their presence mattered. They represented an alternative system of power and influence that operated just outside legitimacy, yet seemed to carry immense weight in the community. Stories circulated among the neighborhood kids about who was connected, who was untouchable. While there is no evidence that he was involved with organized crime as a teenager, he was absorbing the unspoken social lessons of his environment, that certain rules were flexible for some people, and that fear could be a kind of currency. Meanwhile, his identity became increasingly tied to martial arts. As he moved into his late teens, he grew more confident in his physical abilities. But this came with a growing sense of distance from those around him. Friends from school remembered him as someone who was often quiet, sometimes intense, and usually more interested in training than in typical teenage activities. He read whatever he could find on Eastern fighting disciplines, anatomy, and training methods. He began to view the human body as a system that could be manipulated, protected, or disabled through knowledge and practice. What started as an escape from being bullied gradually became an obsession with control of his own body and potentially of others. The broader martial arts boom of the early 1970s only fueled this obsession. Bruce Lee's films exploded onto American screens, thrilling audiences and legitimizing Asian martial arts in the eyes of millions. To many young men, Lee represented the ultimate example of taking a relatively small frame and turning it into something powerful through absolute dedication. For someone like Thomas, who understood what it meant to feel small and weak, the message was electrifying. But where most fans mimicked high kicks in front of a mirror or toyed with nunchaku in the backyard, he drilled with a relentless seriousness that bordered on monastic. At some point in the mid-1970s, his dedication pushed him to make a dramatic decision. If he wanted to fully master the art he had chosen, he would have to go to its source. While exact timelines and details vary in different accounts, multiple law enforcement reports and later court documents agree on the basic fact that, as a young man in his early 20s, Thomas left Brooklyn and traveled to Japan to further his training. It was an unusual step for someone from his background and era. The journey required not only money, likely scraped together from low-paying jobs, savings, and possibly family support, but also the willingness to break away from the familiar streets and faces of his youth. Japan in the 1970s was a world apart from Brooklyn in every conceivable way. The language, customs, and social expectations were entirely different, and the martial arts culture far more formalized. Traditional dojos emphasized not only technique, but also hierarchy, etiquette, and an almost ritualized respect for teachers and training partners. For a young American, especially one from a rough neighborhood, adapting to this environment required humility and discipline. According to later accounts from investigators who reconstructed his life, Thomas appears to have accepted these demands. He trained intensely, reportedly earning advanced ranks and learning to speak at least basic Japanese. Living in Japan also meant exposure to a different relationship between martial skill and violence. Certain schools emphasized self-defense and personal development. Others maintained quiet connections to security work or local toughs. Over the decades, rumors would grow that during his time there, Thomas encountered members of Japan's organized underworld, the Yakuza, or at least observed the way they operated. Some later claims painted him as a man who studied not only the formal techniques of fighting, but also informal lessons about intimidation and the use of fear. These stories are difficult to verify. Law enforcement agencies examined them closely years later, but found little hard evidence to confirm the more dramatic versions. What can be said with certainty is that he immersed himself in a culture where discipline, secrecy, and the management of appearances were deeply valued. In that world, he refined not only his strikes and kicks, but his sense of bodily control. He learned to move quietly, to regulate his breathing, to read the posture and tension of others. Some reports describe him competing in tournaments, testing his skills in regulated combat, where techniques that could cause serious harm were carefully controlled or banned. Within rules and boundaries, he thrived, winning respect and validating the years he had spent in Brooklyn's cramped dojos. Yet there was also an undercurrent to all of this. He was acquiring a level of physical proficiency and psychological composure that, transplanted back into the unstable streets of New York, would make him an exceptionally dangerous man if ever turned to criminal ends. While he honed his craft abroad, his home city was undergoing seismic shifts. New York in the 1970s faced financial crisis, rolling blackouts, and a perception of lawlessness. The famous newspaper headline "Ford to City, Dropped Dead" captured the sense of abandonment many residents felt. Crime surged, and heroin devastated entire blocks. Organized crime families, including the Bonanno family that would later become central to Thomas's life, were adjusting to these changes. They invested more deeply into narcotics, loan sharking, and high-profit schemes, while also navigating brutal internal power struggles. The old code of secrecy was under new pressure from government investigations and federal racketeering laws, but the culture of omerta, silence and loyalty, remained powerful. Into this turbulence, Thomas eventually returned from Japan, likely in the late 1970s. He came back to Brooklyn not as the frail, asthmatic boy who had once been an easy target, but as a hardened martial artist with years of discipline training behind him. Former neighbors and acquaintances would later tell investigators that he carried himself differently, quieter, but with a confidence that made others instinctively keep a bit of distance. Even in ordinary clothes, he moved with a deliberate control that signaled he was not someone to be casually provoked. Yet despite this transformation, he still lacked a conventional path forward. He did not step into a stable trade or the kind of white-collar job that might have allowed him to detach from the world of the streets. In a city where physical intimidation could itself be a commodity, a man with his skills had clear options. Nightclubs, bars, and after-hours spots needed bouncers and security. Certain local businessmen were willing to pay for someone who could quietly discourage trouble, and in neighborhoods where mob families wielded influence, individuals who were good at delivering messages, especially messages backed by the implicit threat of force, were always in demand. As he drifted into this ecosystem, Thomas's martial arts background, which might have led him into sports instruction or legitimate self-defense work, became increasingly entangled with the shadow economy that had long flourished in his borough. This transition from student of discipline to man moving on the periphery of organized crime did not happen in a single moment. It was gradual, facilitated by introductions, favors, and small jobs that seemed minor at first. Helping an acquaintance collect a debt, standing at the door of a club with a watchful eye, escorting someone who feared being followed. Each step drew him closer to men whose reputations rested not on their physical skills, but on their positions in the hierarchy of the mob. They noticed him, as such men always noticed useful tools. Here was someone who kept his mouth shut, controlled his temper, and understood how to handle himself in a confrontation without boasting or drawing unnecessary attention. In that world, these were rare and valuable traits. Yet beneath the surface, deeper psychological currents shaped the choices he was making. Years of feeling powerless, followed by years of training that emphasized mastery and control, had left him with an intense, almost consuming belief in self-reliance. The structures of the martial arts world had given him a framework, but they had not provided a moral anchor strong enough to resist the gravitational pull of the neighborhood culture he had returned to. When discipline divorced from ethics meets an environment where violence is a tool of business, the result can be catastrophic. In Thomas's case, his personal history and his surroundings were on a collision course. By the turn of the 1980s, New York's law enforcement agencies were starting to adapt more aggressively to the world he was entering. The FBI, the DEA, and local police departments were sharing intelligence on organized crime with a new seriousness. Undercover operations, wiretaps, and informant programs were expanding. Prosecutors were learning how to use racketeering statutes to dismantle not just individual operations, but entire criminal networks. However, this tightening net was not immediately visible to those embedded in neighborhood-level activity. From street level, the old rules still seemed to apply. As long as you were careful, loyal to the right people, and ruthless when necessary, there was room to make money and gain status. It was in this volatile space, between the fading world of traditional neighborhood loyalty and the rising force of federal prosecution, that Thomas Pitera began to forge the identity that would one day terrify both criminals and agents alike. The boy who had once hid from bullies now attracted the attention of men whose approval came at a heavy price. His transformation from isolated, sickly child to disciplined fighter was complete. The next transformation, from dangerous fighter to notorious enforcer for one of New York's most powerful crime families, was about to begin, driven not only by his choices but by the era that shaped them. When he stepped off the plane from Japan and back onto New York soil, he returned to a city that barely resembled the one he had left. The skyline was the same, but almost everything at street level felt more frayed. Graffiti-covered subway cars, shuttered storefronts, hollow-eyed attics clustered in building doorways. This was the New York of the late 1970s and early 1980s, battered by financial crisis and rising crime. For Thomas Pitera, however, the chaos outside contrasted sharply with the internal order he had spent years building. He carried with him a drilled-in routine, early rising, physical conditioning, kata practice, and mental focus. People who later encountered him noticed that he seemed to move in his own orbit, as if the noise of the city never quite reached him. At first, he tried to build a life that blended that discipline with whatever opportunities the boroughs could offer someone of his background. He took on work that made the most of his imposing presence and his calm under pressure. Jobs around bars and clubs that required someone who could stand at a door, watch a room, and intervene without panic when a situation turned volatile. In the New York nightlife of that era, where alcohol, drugs, and simmering tensions often mixed, this kind of work was plentiful. Owners weren't looking for chatter. They wanted someone who could end trouble quickly and ideally without attracting the police. In these dimly lit rooms, people started to notice that the thin, glasses-wearing kid they once remembered from the neighborhood had become something very different: compact, coiled, and unsettlingly composed. The neighborhoods he gravitated toward were also the neighborhoods where organized crime remained deeply rooted. In parts of Brooklyn and Queens, the line between ordinary social life and the underworld was thin. Men with quiet reputations held court in modest storefront clubs, playing cards, watching sports, and handling the business of the Bonanno family and other organizations behind closed doors. To walk past one of these clubs was to see, at least on the surface, nothing remarkable. A few older men in shirt sleeves, a TV flickering in the corner, coffee cups and ashtrays. To step inside, if you were invited, was to enter a world where favors, debts, and loyalties formed an invisible scaffolding around every conversation. By this time, law enforcement already knew these clubs well. The FBI's penetration of the Bonanno family through the undercover operation involving Agent Joseph Pistone, later known publicly as Donnie Brasco, had blown apart the illusion of invulnerability that some of these men once enjoyed. That operation, which ended in 1981, exposed the family's inner workings and contributed to a violent internal war, culminating in the notorious murder of 3 Bonanno capos in Brooklyn. The aftermath left the family shaken and deeply suspicious. New leadership under Philip "Rusty" Raselli and his powerful street lieutenant Joseph Massino sought to tighten discipline. Trust became a scarcer commodity, and the value of someone who appeared both loyal and highly capable increased accordingly. This was the climate in which Thomas drifted from the periphery of nightlife work toward the orbit of the Bonanno family. The shift was not marked by a formal announcement or a single dramatic event. It began with introductions: a bar owner who knew someone who was connected, a favor done for a man whose surname carried quiet weight on the block, a small job passed to him with an unspoken test attached. Perhaps it was collecting a debt that had lingered too long, escorting someone who feared an ambush, or simply standing in a corner of a club where the presence of a trained fighter might cool hot heads. Each favor done competently and without complaint made the next request more likely. In American organized crime, the term associate has a specific meaning. It does not signify a sworn member of a family, but indicates someone who works with them, earns with them, and is, to varying degrees, under their protection and control. By the early 1980s, according to later court testimony and investigative records, Thomas had become such an associate in the Bonanno sphere. He was not yet a made man bound by the solemn induction ritual, but he was no longer just an anonymous face at the edge of the room. Certain Bonanno figures, including the Brooklyn-based capo Anthony Sparrow, began to see him as a useful resource, a disciplined, quiet man with specialized skills and no long criminal history that might draw attention. Sparrow's reputation in those years was that of an old-school mobster rooted in his neighborhood, careful and understated. His Bath Beach Social Club was a gathering place for Bonanno members and associates who handled everything from gambling to loans to narcotics trafficking. For a man like Sparrow, the shock of the Donnie Brasco debacle and the internal wars that followed reinforced the need for caution. Someone like Thomas, self-controlled, circumspect, and physically fearsome without being flashy, fit the emerging model of what the family needed in the 1980s. Not brawling street toughs prone to barroom brawls, but specialists who could get things done quietly. As his connections deepened, so did the responsibilities placed on him. He moved beyond guarding doors and began taking part in more complex schemes that blended the traditional rackets of organized crime with the newer, highly lucrative world of narcotics. The heroin trade, in particular, had become central to many organized crime families despite the old admonitions of some bosses against getting too deeply involved. In the New York of that era, heroin and later cocaine and crack devastated entire neighborhoods, turning addicts into desperate customers and small-time dealers into both potential earners and potential liabilities. Through these channels, Thomas crossed paths with a Brooklyn drug dealer named Frank Gangi. Gangi, who later cooperated with authorities, told investigators that he and Thomas developed a working partnership that combined Gangi's connections in the street-level drug world with Thomas's growing status in the banana hierarchy. Together, according to court records and trial testimony, they oversaw a network that distributed narcotics in Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. Their operation was hardly unique. Dozens of similar crews operated in the city. What set theirs apart, from the government's perspective, was the way it blended underworld discipline with a readiness to respond to perceived betrayal or competition with swift, sometimes lethal, retribution. For law enforcement, the human cost of these operations became increasingly visible in the 1980s. Neighborhoods that once saw sporadic violence now endured regular street-level disputes over territory and unpaid debts. Families watched relatives lose jobs, relationships, and health to addictions fed in part by the networks that men like Gangi and Thomas supplied. At the same time, community residents were often reluctant to speak openly about what they saw. Fear of retaliation and a distrust of authorities combined to create an environment where disappearances could go formally unreported or be dismissed as people simply taking off to escape debts or warrants. Inside this environment, Thomas cultivated a specific persona that blended his martial arts background with his emerging role as an enforcer. Associates later described how he remained devoted to his training regimen. He practiced regularly in his apartment, maintained his physical conditioning, and treated his body as a disciplined tool. That regimen wasn't just about personal pride. It reinforced the aura that surrounded him. Word spread among criminals that he was not simply another man with a gun, but someone who understood anatomy, knew how to strike with precision, and could remain unnervingly calm under pressure. It was during this period that the nickname Tommy Karate began to attach itself to him more firmly in both underworld gossip and law enforcement files. The nickname was not a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was a label of wariness. In a culture that already valued toughness, to be marked out as someone who had turned combat into a studied craft was to be set apart. Some associates were fascinated, even admiring. Others found it disturbing. The martial artist who trains for competition or self-defense operates within rules and ethical codes. The man described in later indictments and testimony applied that training in a world where disputes were not settled in tournaments and where the consequences of defeat were permanent. As his reputation solidified, so did his operational habits. Investigators would later learn that he paid close attention to news about forensic science and police methods. He understood that in the 1980s, law enforcement's tools were advancing. Improved crime scene techniques, growing DNA research, and better coordination between agencies. The old days when killers could assume that bodies might simply go unidentified were fading. To adapt, some gangsters sought to use more remote locations for their activities. In Staten Island, a borough then still marked by large stretches of undeveloped or lightly patrolled land, certain wooded or marshy areas offered precisely the kind of isolation they wanted. According to federal prosecutors, Thomas made particular use of an overgrown tract of land in Staten Island, part of a broader area of fields and marshland that was rarely visited by ordinary residents. There, law enforcement agents would eventually uncover not only buried weapons and narcotics, but also, in time, human remains tied by investigators to several of the killings for which he was later charged. Neighbors in his Brooklyn community might have seen him as a quiet man who came and went without causing visible trouble. Out in those neglected stretches of Staten Island, according to the government's case, a very different part of his life played out. Within the Bonanno family, his usefulness did not go unnoticed. The 1980s were a period of renewed aggression against organized crime by federal authorities. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, gave prosecutors new leverage, allowing them to treat individual crimes like pieces of a larger pattern and target those who ordered or benefited from them, not just those who pulled triggers. As bosses and captains watched high-level figures in various families face long sentences, the fear of informants grew sharper. Anyone suspected of cooperating with the government, or even of being unreliable under pressure, could quickly find themselves marked as a liability. In this climate, a man known for his ability to carry out orders without complaint and to keep his own counsel, as was later said of Thomas in courtroom testimony, was particularly valued. The government would later argue that he moved from being merely an associate to an indispensable contractor of sorts, a man to whom people within the family turned when they believed a terrifying message needed to be sent or a potential witness needed to be removed from the picture. The accuracy of the government's estimates of how many such acts he ultimately committed remains debated, but even the conservative figures contained in his indictments paint a picture of sustained, organized, and carefully managed violence. On the streets, his growing importance was mirrored by a subtle shift in how people interacted with him. He did not strut or loudly boast. Those tendencies were frowned upon in serious organized crime circles and drew the wrong kind of attention. Instead, he sat silently in the corners of clubs, spoke when spoken to, and watched. Other associates noticed that when he entered a room, conversations sometimes grew more guarded. Even among criminals accustomed to danger, there were tears of fear, and the man known as Tommy Karate occupied one of the higher tiers. He also began to accumulate the trappings of underworld success, though in a relatively understated way. There were better cars, nicer clothes, small luxuries that signaled to those in the know that he was doing well. His income came from a mixture of sources: his share of drug profits, payments for enforcement work, and involvement in various schemes that passed through banana channels. To outside observers who did not know his background, he might have looked like many other upwardly mobile men of his generation and neighborhood, a private person whose exact line of work was left politely unexamined by those around him. Yet the double life always left traces. Families of missing small-time dealers or low-level associates, people with connections to the street trade, began asking quiet questions. A brother failed to come home. A girlfriend stopped hearing from her partner. Sometimes rumors filtered back. The missing person had crossed the wrong people, had been talking too much, or had owed money to the wrong crew. In some of these stories, the name Tommy surfaced, rarely as the only name mentioned, but often as the one that carried the most weight. These were not formal accusations but street-level stories, impossible for outsiders to verify at the time, yet they contributed to a growing aura around him. Law enforcement, for its part, did not initially focus on him as a central figure. In the early and mid-1980s, agencies were occupied with larger priorities: dismantling the leadership structures of the five families, prosecuting notorious bosses, and pursuing major drug traffickers whose operations spanned continents. In the Bonanno family, attention centered on men like Rosselli, Massino, and other high-ranking figures. A disciplined but comparatively low-profile enforcer in his early 30s did not immediately draw the spotlight. Still, individual detectives and federal agents working specific cases began to notice that his name appeared in connection with certain disappearances and drug networks. One of the earliest, more serious glimmers of official interest came through narcotics investigations. As the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration and New York task forces mapped out heroin and cocaine distribution chains, they started to see recurring patterns in Brooklyn and Staten Island. Wiretaps, informant reports, and surveillance suggested that Thomas and his circle were not only distributing drugs, but also operating under the protective umbrella of the Bonanno family. When investigators pieced together who regularly met at which clubs and who was seen with which known mob figures, his face showed up often enough to warrant closer attention. Inside his own circle, however, signs of strain were emerging. The same fear of informants that made him valuable also made every relationship fragile. Drug crews were notorious for internal distrust. The money was fast, but the stakes were high, and the temptations to cut side deals or divert product were constant. Frank Gangi, who had been one of his key partners, lived in this atmosphere of pervasive suspicion. According to Gangi's later statements, disputes over money, drugs, and trust began to erode the cohesion of their crew. Men whispered about who might be skimming, who might be unreliable under police questioning, and who might already be cooperating. These tensions set off a sequence of events that would eventually bring the weight of the federal government down on Thomas's shoulders. In the tightly wound ecosystem of the 1980s New York underworld, a network built on fear and silence could function only as long as its participants believed in the inevitability of consequence and the impossibility of escape. But as RICO cases resulted in life sentences, as the witness security program offered new lives to those willing to testify, and as the number of cooperating witnesses slowly climbed, cracks spread through even the most disciplined organizations. By the late 1980s, Thomas occupied a paradoxical position. To the Bonanno family, he was an asset, a problem solver whose reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness served their interests. To many on the street, he was a warning embodied in human form, a reminder of what could happen to those who violated underworld codes. To law enforcement, he was becoming a name that appeared too frequently in too many troubling contexts to be ignored. He continued to train, to project the same cool composure he had cultivated since his youth, perhaps believing that the control he exercised over his body and immediate environment could extend to the increasingly complex web of danger closing in around him. It could not. The same characteristics that had made him so effective, his methodical approach, his reliance on a close-knit circle, his confidence in the fear he inspired, would soon intersect with the relentless logic of federal investigation. Former allies would turn into witnesses. Isolated marshland that had once seemed to swallow secrets would instead yield evidence. And the man who had once seemed almost invisible to the authorities would find his name on the front page as prosecutors began to detail, count by count, what they believed he had done in the decades since returning from Japan. By the middle of the 1980s, New York's drug crisis had reached a punishing peak. Crack cocaine had ripped through poorer neighborhoods, while heroin and powder cocaine continued to fuel a black market economy that stretched from Latin American cartels to street corners in Brooklyn and Queens. For organized crime families, narcotics were both a risk and an irresistible source of revenue. Old bosses still repeated the line that dealing drugs brought too much heat, but on the street, younger figures understood that the profits were transformative. It was in this environment that Thomas Pitera's role within the Bonanno family solidified and darkened. As his working partnership with Frank Gangi developed, their operations settled into a grim routine. Couriers moved product and money between stash apartments and meeting spots. Street-level dealers, some with only a few years or even months of experience in the life, funneled cash back up the chain. Gangi, with his knowledge of the drug market, handled many of the day-to-day logistics. Thomas, increasingly, served as the one who enforced discipline on customers who got ideas about skipping payments, on low-level dealers who tried to cheat the weight, and on anyone suspected of talking too freely to law enforcement. Behind the scenes, his organizational status changed. By most accounts, he had begun as an associate of Anthony Sparrow's crew, but as his reliability and willingness to carry out serious work became evident, his name rose higher. According to later testimony and investigative reports, by the late 1980s, he was formally inducted into the Bonanno family as a full member, a soldier under Sparrow's regime. The rite of induction, held in secret in a private home or back room, symbolized a point of no return. In the traditional ceremony, the initiate pledged loyalty above all else, swearing to obey his superiors and place the interests of the family over his own. A small religious image was burned in his hands as an oath was recited, binding his fate to the organization. For Thomas, whose life had already been anchored in routines of discipline and hierarchy from his martial arts training, the transition into this new form of structured belonging may have felt almost natural. But the stakes were now different. In Japan, discipline had been directed towards self-mastery and competition within defined rules. In the banana world, discipline and hierarchy existed to maintain a criminal enterprise that rested on intimidation, extortion, and, when deemed necessary, killing. With induction came not only status but also obligations. When a superior gave an order, the expectation was simple: it would be carried out. The network around him reflected that logic. Gangi and other associates, who had once seen Thomas primarily as a physically imposing partner, now understood more clearly that he was plugged into the family's internal machinery. His word carried more weight. His disapproval meant more danger. Those who worked under or alongside him watched as men who caused problems for the operation, by stealing, by defying instructions, or by attracting police attention, were first warned, then marginalized, and in the most serious cases, simply disappeared. The government would later argue that it was in these years, roughly 1987 to 1989, that his involvement in multiple homicides reached its height. The exact number of killings he personally committed or ordered has long been a subject of debate. Prosecutors at his trial focused on a series of specific cases they believed they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Journalists and some investigators, drawing on broader intelligence, suggested the real tally was far higher. What is clear from the indictment and the testimony of cooperating witnesses is that several people tied to drug trafficking and the banana sphere vanished under circumstances that pointed toward him. In one case, a small-time dealer connected to their network reportedly tried to keep part of a shipment's proceeds and lied about the shortfall. Within drug crews, such thefts were not treated as minor infractions. They threatened the entire structure by suggesting that rules could be bent without consequence. According to Gangi's later testimony, the decision was made that this particular man would not be given a second chance. Gangi claimed that Thomas took the lead in planning and carrying out the killing, approaching it with the same measured focus he brought to his training, choosing the time and place carefully, limiting the circle of people involved, and afterward taking deliberate steps to ensure there would be no easy evidence trail. Another victim, the government contended, was a young woman close to Gangi who had been around enough of their dealings to know faces, routines, and locations. When relationships in that world soured, personal connections could turn into liabilities. Prosecutors asserted that Thomas saw her as a potential risk, someone who might talk under pressure or out of anger. Gangi later told a jury that she too was lured away under false pretenses and never returned. According to the government's case, she was one of several victims whose bodies would eventually be tied back to the same isolated section of Staten Island marshland that Thomas had scouted. That tract of land, overgrown and largely ignored by ordinary residents, became central to both his operations and, years later, to the prosecution's evidence. Staten Island in the 1980s still bore wide stretches of semi-rural terrain, woods, vacant lots, and marshes that felt a world away from Manhattan skyscrapers, though only a short drive removed. To casual passers-by, these fields and thickets were simply neglected corners of the borough. To men like Thomas, they offered something else: privacy. According to investigators who later reconstructed his movements, he made repeated trips to one particular area, sometimes alone, sometimes with Gangi or other associates. They noticed that he was attentive to basic counter-forensic measures long before such topics were widely discussed in the press. He chose spots off main paths, paid attention to how the ground drained after rain, and was meticulous about not leaving obvious traces linked to him personally. In the pre-digital era, without surveillance cameras on every corner, such precautions could significantly complicate an investigation. The very invisibility of many of his victims contributed to his ability to operate for so long. Several were involved in the illicit economy themselves, low-level dealers, couriers, or associates whose names were not known outside their circles. When they vanished, family members might suspect foul play, but fear of retaliation or distrust of the police often kept them from pushing too hard. In some cases, relatives simply assumed their loved one had fled debts, warrants, or dangerous rivals and would resurface in time. Missing person reports, when filed, were sometimes thin on details, and detectives with overloaded caseloads could only do so much without witnesses or physical evidence. From the vantage point of law enforcement, the late 1980s were a period of triage. Homicide squads in New York were dealing with record numbers of killings. Detectives had to prioritize cases with witnesses, clear motives, or identifiable suspects. A disappearance tied to a person already known to be living on the edge of the law, without a body, without a crime scene, and without cooperative informants, often sank into the background noise of the city's larger crisis. That was the space in which Thomas thrived, a gray area where a series of disappearances could be explained away, at least temporarily, as the natural attrition of a brutal lifestyle. Inside the banana hierarchy, his standing continued to rise. He was seen at more meetings, consulted more frequently on sensitive matters. Associates observed that he handled himself around higher-ranking figures with the same composed reserve he showed everywhere else, respectful but not ingratiating, quiet but not silent. In a world where reckless talk could be fatal, this self-control was prized. There were stories passed in low tones among younger associates about how he had handled this or that problem, always bereft of detail, heavy with implication. At the same time, there were moments that revealed how precarious even his position was. The Bonanno family in the late 1980s remained haunted by the Donnie Brasco scandal and continuing federal pressure. Bosses worried constantly about electronic surveillance, cooperating witnesses, and undercover agents. The lesson they drew was that nothing, not even a decades-long relationship, guaranteed silence once a person faced the possibility of life in prison. That fear permeated every level of the organization, from bosses down to soldiers like Thomas and associates like Gangi. These anxieties sharpened already fraught relationships within his crew. Drug money amplified conflicts. The more there was to divide, the more men wondered whether they were getting their fair share. Disputes over missing sums or alleged side deals could flare up quickly. Each argument carried an underlying threat. If one side felt slighted enough, they might go to a higher-ranking figure and present their version of events, hoping to tilt favor their way. In an environment where accusations could be deadly, even private complaints were calculated risks. Frank Gangi, moving in this world and feeling those pressures, became increasingly unstable. Later, when he chose to cooperate with authorities, he would describe living under a constant, suffocating fear, not only of rival crews or police, but of the very people he worked beside. He portrayed Thomas as both protector and looming danger, a man who could ensure his safety so long as trust held, but who, if he ever decided that Gangi was a liability, would deal with him as unflinchingly as he had dealt with others. Whether or not every detail of Gangi's portrayal is accurate, a question lawyers would contest at trial. It is clear that by the late 1980s, the relationship between the two men had become tangled in mutual dependence and mutual suspicion. They knew each other's routines, knew where money was hidden, knew details about killings that could devastate any defense if ever spoken aloud in a courtroom. That knowledge bound them together even as it drove wedges between them. On the other side of the thin blue line, investigators were inching closer, though neither man could fully see it yet. Federal authorities had been building cases against the Bonanno leadership, including Joseph Massino and his lieutenants, by pulling threads wherever they could find them: gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and increasingly, drug trafficking. The Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces, known as OCDETF, funneled resources into precisely the kind of operation that intersected with Gangi and Thomas's activities. DEA agents, FBI squads, and NYPD detectives began trading notes on which names came up in which contexts, and on what patterns emerged around certain missing individuals. Surveillance picked up fragments. Cars registered to known Bonanno associates were spotted repeatedly near certain Brooklyn social clubs in specific Staten Island locations. Phones linked to lower-level dealers and couriers were intercepted, capturing muted references to that karate guy or Tommy. As so often happens, the highest value intelligence, however, came not from wiretaps but from frightened people making quiet deals to save themselves. One of the earliest significant breakthroughs appears to have come from someone in the drug chain who feared they, too, might soon go missing. Whether out of self-preservation, anger, or calculated pragmatism, this person began feeding investigators information about the structure of a particular Bonanno-connected drug network and the role of a man known as Tommy Karate. They spoke of a Staten Island burial ground, of nighttime trips with shovels, of whispered boasts or warnings. The information was fragmentary and needed corroboration, but it was enough to convince agents that something serious lay beneath the surface. With each new piece of intelligence, the investigators' picture sharpened. They realized that the pattern of disappearances connected to Thomas and his circle fit a particular profile. Victims often had drug ties, were linked to the same few neighborhoods, and vanished without leaving traces of ordinary life continuing. No bank withdrawals, no calls home, no evidence of relocation. Almost all had last been seen in contexts where Bonanno influence was strong. To seasoned, organized crime investigators, these were classic markers of underworld killings, even if bodies had not yet been found. For years, that lack of physical evidence had insulated men like Thomas. But by the late 1980s, law enforcement was increasingly willing to take on cases built around circumstantial evidence and cooperating witnesses, especially when bolstered by any kind of forensic discovery. Quietly, in internal memos and strategy sessions, agents and prosecutors began discussing how they might establish that certain wooded sections of Staten Island held the key to unlocking a broader case, not just against individual killers, but against a segment of the Bonanno family's operations. The decision to pursue a search warrant for such a site was not taken lightly. To disturb a suspected burial ground without solid probable cause risked not only legal setbacks, but also the possibility of permanently damaging or contaminating evidence. Agents needed enough specific information, approximate locations, time frames, and an articulable link between that land and identifiable missing persons. They continued to cultivate informants pressing for details. Where exactly did the cars park? Which path did they take into the woods? Were there landmarks? How long did they stay? Meanwhile, life on the street went on. In Brooklyn social clubs, the nightly rituals persisted. Coffee poured into small cups, card games. News updates about who had been indicted and who had gone away to prison. Thomas still moved through this world with the same self-contained intensity. He trained, he met with Gangi and others, he collected money, he traveled to Staten Island when business required it. Whatever suspicions he harbored about informants, whatever extra precautions he took in response to news of fresh indictments against other crews, he had no way of seeing the full extent of the web closing in. There were hints, though, that pressure was building. More frequent law enforcement presence near certain clubs, unmarked cars lingering a little too long on residential streets, questions reaching him indirectly about whether anyone had seen a particular missing dealer. He had lived around police attention his entire life. He understood that some level of scrutiny was a permanent feature of the environment. What he could not easily discern was that his name had begun to shift in internal FBI and DEA discussions, from just another associate to a priority subject, a target around whom agents might be able to construct a larger racketeering case. On Staten Island, the overgrown fields and marshes he had once treated almost as an extension of his workspace remained outwardly unchanged. Grass grew thick in the summer. Snow and ice hardened the ground in winter. Children played in some nearby areas, never suspecting what lay underfoot in the more remote patches. Dog walkers, joggers, and occasional dirt bikers passed by. The secrets buried there stayed hidden, for the moment, beneath soil that gave no hint of the story it held. But inside the offices of prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, maps spread across conference tables told a different tale. Dots marking last known locations of missing individuals clustered in suspicious patterns. Marginal notes referenced Bonanno, Sparrow Crew, Gangi, and increasingly, Pitera. A plan was forming to turn whispers and rumors into affidavits, affidavits into warrants, and warrants into a search that might finally expose what had for so long remained concealed in the shadows of Staten Island's neglected land. The plan to tear open the quiet surface of Staten Island's forgotten land began, as such things often do, with a sworn statement in a judge's chambers. After months of rumors, confidential tips, and fragmentary surveillance, agents finally had something more concrete. A witness willing to describe, under oath, being led deep into a particular stretch of overgrown terrain by men he identified as Bonanno associates, including the one everyone called Tommy Karate. He remembered where they had parked, how long they had walked, the turn near a distinctive tree, the broken fence post they stepped over. He spoke of shovels, of tense conversations, of being ordered to wait at a distance while others went on ahead. Prosecutors and agents in the Eastern District of New York pored over his account. They knew the stakes. To ask a federal judge for a warrant to dig up semi-public land in search of human remains tied to organized crime meant they were moving from speculative intelligence into a case that, if successful, could expose one of the most feared enforcers in the Bonanno family. They cross-checked his story against aerial photographs and tax maps, against patrol logs from local precincts, and against the patchwork of missing person cases that had accumulated over the preceding years. The lines matched closely enough to convince them it was worth the risk. When the warrant was granted, the operation that followed was careful and methodical. In the early mornings, before most commuters had started their day, unmarked cars and vans rolled quietly onto Staten Island. Plainclothes agents and detectives met with forensic specialists from the medical examiner's office and crime scene units. They walked the land first, boots crunching through undergrowth, studying the contours of the ground. To an untrained eye, it looked like any other neglected corner of the borough, patches of scrub trees, uneven soil, discarded trash. To the investigators, subtle depressions and anomalies in the earth hinted at what might lie beneath. They began to dig, slowly and deliberately. There were no dramatic backhoes ripping through the ground, no scenes of spectacle. Instead, shovels and trowels moved inch by inch, soil lifted and sifted by gloved hands. Photographs documented each stage. Flags and stakes marked out small grids. The work was painstaking, the mood sober. For the law enforcement officers on site, many of whom had worked homicide for years, the search carried a particular weight. They were not only looking for evidence against a suspected killer, they were also, potentially, about to locate the final resting places of people whose families had been left in limbo. The first discovery came as a quiet murmur, not a shout. A technician noted something in the soil that did not belong there. Work stopped, and the area was cleared of everyone not essential to the moment. Carefully, layer by thin layer, they exposed what they had suspected they might find: human remains, long buried but still recognizably distinct from the surrounding earth. There was no triumph in the air, no sense of victory. Agents exchanged glances heavy with the knowledge that this confirmed not only their theory about the site, but the reality of what had been happening in the shadows of the city for years. Word of the dig could not be entirely concealed. Staten Island residents noticed the unusual activity. Official vehicles clustered near an otherwise unremarkable field, officers blocking access, the slow choreography of a serious crime scene operation. Local reporters began to make calls, piecing together that federal authorities were on scene. Before long, newspapers ran cautious stories about a suspected mob burial ground being examined. The articles were short on detail but rich in implication, suggesting that the same borough where families took Sunday drives along quiet roads might also hold the evidence of organized crime's most secretive acts. Back at the medical examiner's office, the remains recovered from the first days of digging were examined with a mix of modern science and old-fashioned detective work. Forensic anthropologists assessed age, sex, and possible time since death. Any personal items recovered nearby, clothing fragments, jewelry, small objects were cataloged. Dental records, when they could be obtained from families of missing persons, were compared against what the examiners could reconstruct. Slowly, matches emerged. At least some of the bones from the Staten Island field belonged to people whose disappearances had long been whispered about in connection with drug debts and mob politics. Each identification rippled outward. Detectives reached out to families who had spent years in a limbo of uncertainty. They did not deliver closure in any tidy sense. There is no tidy way to inform someone that their child, sibling, or partner has been found in a makeshift grave. They did, however, finally answer questions that had haunted those households. The late-night wondering if a knock on the door might still bring the missing person home, the unspoken fear that something terrible had happened, and the pain of having no body to mourn. Now there were names to match to remains, and all signs pointed toward the same underworld circle. For prosecutors building a case against Thomas Pitera and his associates, the Staten Island findings were invaluable. They transformed previously intangible suspicions into something juries could understand: physical evidence, photographs, forensic reports. Yet bones alone could not tell the complete story of how those individuals had died, or at whose direction. To move from a grim archaeological record to a criminal conviction, they needed witnesses, people from inside the operation who could link the names on missing persons lists and the remains in the earth to specific decisions and actions. Pressure on the gang's drug network intensified. Task forces accelerated ongoing investigations, pushing harder on low-level participants. Arrests on narcotics and weapons charges increased. Some suspects were offered choices no one in their world ever wanted to face: risk spending the rest of their lives in federal prison by staying silent, or break the underworld's code and cooperate with authorities. Most refused, at least at first. The fear of being labeled a rat and what that meant in their communities remained powerful. Frank Gangi was one of those caught in this tightening grip. Arrested on serious drug charges linked directly to his activities with Thomas, he initially tried to bluff his way through interrogations. He insisted that he knew nothing about murders, that he was merely a small-time dealer caught up in something larger than himself. Agents listened, then began laying out, piece by piece, what they already had: photographs of the Staten Island dig, lists of recovered items, timelines of disappearances that corresponded suspiciously well with his known movements and associations. In proffer sessions, off-the-record meetings where potential cooperators can speak candidly in hopes of negotiating a deal, Gangi began, hesitantly, to talk. At first he minimized, describing drug deals and collections, trying to frame himself as a peripheral figure. Prosecutors, who had heard this narrative many times from many men in similar positions, pressed him gently but firmly. They made it clear that the evidence already in hand, combined with applicable racketeering statutes, could expose him to a sentence functionally equivalent to life behind bars. Federal guidelines were not friendly to repeat narcotics offenders linked to organized crime, and judges in the Eastern District had shown little sympathy for lieutenants in drug-fueled conspiracies. Somewhere in those long sessions, something shifted. Perhaps it was self-preservation, perhaps genuine fear, perhaps accumulated exhaustion from years of living under constant threat. Whatever the exact mix of motives, Gangi crossed the psychological line that separates a suspect from a cooperator. He agreed to tell the government everything he knew and to testify in court if required, in exchange for the possibility, not the promise, but the possibility of a reduced sentence and placement in a witness protection program after his usefulness was exhausted. What he described over the following weeks astonished even veteran investigators hardened by decades of organized crime work. In matter-of-fact tones, he laid out the structure of the drug ring he and Thomas had run, where their stash apartments were located, how money was laundered, which couriers could be trusted. Then, gradually, he delved into the darker core of their activities. He named individuals who had fallen under suspicion of stealing, of disloyalty, of talking to law enforcement. He described how some of them were lured into cars for what they thought were routine meetings and instead never returned home. Crucially, he linked these stories directly to Thomas, portraying him as the driving force behind the most serious acts. Agents did not take his word at face value. Every name he mentioned, every date, every location was cross-checked against records they already had. Phone tolls, surveillance logs, prior police reports, the preliminary forensic findings from Staten Island. In case after case, the patterns aligned. When Gangi said that a certain associate had disappeared during a particular month after a dispute over drug proceeds, detectives could see that this same person's family had reported them missing shortly thereafter. When he identified places where Thomas preferred to conduct sensitive business, those addresses matched locations previously noted in unrelated surveillance. Most damning were the overlaps between his recollections and the burial sites. Shown aerial images and sketch maps, Gangi pointed to specific clusters of trees, fence lines, and clearings, describing how Thomas had chosen certain spots and how they had been used. His descriptions of where bodies had been left and how deep they had been buried dovetailed with where remains had already been found, and suggested that additional graves might still be undiscovered. Acting on his information, agents returned to the Staten Island field and expanded the scope of their search. In several of the new areas he had marked, further human remains were recovered. By then, the press had begun to assign a chilling nickname to the area, echoing older mob stories about hidden graves on the city's edges. For residents who had driven past those fields for years without a second thought, the news was jarring. Community leaders held meetings. Parents reassured children that the violence being discussed was part of an adult criminal world, far removed from their own lives, even as they themselves struggled with the realization that men capable of such acts had been living, for decades, in ordinary houses not far from their own. Inside banana circles, the effects were just as unsettling, if less public. Rumors spread quickly that someone had gone bad, that a close associate of Thomas was talking to the government. The organization had experienced betrayal before, in the Donnie Brasco fiasco and in other, smaller cases, but the idea that a key figure in such a sensitive operation might be cooperating triggered intense anxiety. Soldiers and associates glanced more carefully at one another in clubs and restaurants. Conversations were shortened, coded, or cut off altogether. Some members went temporarily underground, avoiding their usual haunts in hopes of riding out whatever storm was coming. For Thomas himself, the exact scope of the threat was initially opaque. He almost certainly heard that law enforcement was active on Staten Island and that bones had been found. He likely knew that Gangi had been arrested and that he had not, to anyone's knowledge, resurfaced in the usual underworld circles after that. If he suspected cooperation, he might not have known yet how detailed or credible Gangi's disclosures were. Investigators, mindful of the danger he posed and the possibility that he might flee or retaliate if spooked too early, were careful about what information leaked back into his world. Meanwhile, prosecutors were assembling the framework of a major case. They did not intend to charge Thomas merely with isolated acts. Instead, they pursued a comprehensive racketeering indictment under RICO, arguing that he had been part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, and that the murders, drug trafficking, and related crimes were all interconnected components of that conspiracy. Draft indictments listed counts of murder in aid of racketeering, narcotics distribution, firearms violations, and other offenses. Cooperating witnesses like Gangi would provide the narrative spine. Forensic evidence and documentary records would supply the corroboration. Before they could unveil any of it in court, however, they had to bring Thomas into custody. Given his martial arts background, his reputation for calm violence, and the likelihood that he possessed multiple weapons, the arrest operation was planned with exceptional care. Agents studied his routines. When he left his apartment where he parked, how often he traveled to Staten Island, whether he was usually alone or accompanied by others. They identified the times of day when he was least likely to be surrounded by potential allies, and most likely to be just waking or just returning home, slightly off guard. When the arrest finally came, it was swift and controlled. In the pre-dawn dim of a Brooklyn morning around 1990, a team of federal agents and NYPD officers approached his residence. They wore body armor, their weapons drawn but kept low, following protocols honed in dozens of high-risk operations. A battering ram was on standby, but as it turned out, they did not need to smash their way through steel. A combination of key access and surprise let them into the building quietly. At his door, they announced themselves, identifying their agencies and shouting his name. Accounts differ slightly on the exact sequence of what followed, whether there was a brief pause, words exchanged through the door, or a more immediate entry. What is consistent across law enforcement recollections is that there was no extended standoff. Faced with an overwhelming show of force, with hallways sealed and escape routes covered, Thomas did not engage in a last-minute physical confrontation. He was taken into custody without gunfire, handcuffed, read his rights, and escorted out under the eyes of neighbors who peered through curtains or watched from apartment doors, trying to reconcile the quiet man they'd seen coming and going with the grim accusations that, within hours, would appear in headlines. Inside his home, agents found what they had expected: multiple weapons, including firearms and martial arts instruments, cash, documents, items that prosecutors would later argue linked him to the narcotics trade and to specific victims. None of it, on its own, was enough to secure a conviction for murder, but taken together with the testimony of cooperators and the physical evidence from Staten Island, it added weight to the government's narrative. This was not a man caught up by chance in other people's crimes, but a central player in a violent, highly organized enterprise. At his initial court appearance, the contrast between the mundane rituals of the justice system and the accusations swirling around him was stark. In a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, under fluorescent lights, a magistrate judge read out the basic charges: racketeering, murder in aid of racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, firearms offenses. The language was formal, stripped of the sensational phrasing that newspapers had begun to use, but the implications were severe. If convicted on the most serious counts, he faced the real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison with no chance of parole. Through a court-appointed interpreter when necessary, and with his attorney at his side, Thomas entered a plea of not guilty. He showed little visible reaction as the judge discussed detention. Prosecutors argued vehemently that he should not be released pending trial. They cited not only the gravity of the charges, but also his demonstrated capacity for planning, his martial training, and the likelihood, in their view, that he would either flee or retaliate against witnesses if given the opportunity. The defense countered with offers of conditions, sureties, assurances. But in an era when federal judges had watched too many organized crime cases unravel because of intimidation and flight, such assurances carried limited weight. Bail was denied. He was remanded to custody, transferred to a secure federal detention facility to await trial. There, behind steel doors and monitored hallways, the man who had once moved freely between Brooklyn social clubs and Staten Island fields found his world drastically reduced to a cell, a recreation yard, and the occasional trip, shackled, back to the courthouse for pretrial hearings. His days of training in wide open spaces were gone. Whatever physical routines he maintained had to be adapted to the confines of a prison tier. Outside, the legal machinery ground forward. Defense counsel filed motions challenging the admissibility of certain evidence, seeking to limit what the jury would hear about uncharged acts or broader allegations beyond the specific counts in the indictment. Prosecutors responded with thick briefs arguing that the pattern of his conduct was integral to understanding the charged conspiracy. Gangi, housed in a secure location under the watch of marshals, continued to debrief, refining his account and preparing for the possibility of facing Thomas across a courtroom. For the families of the dead, the period between arrest and trial was a strange, suspended time. On one hand, they saw in the newspapers that someone had finally been charged with the killings that had taken their loved ones. On the other, they understood that charges were not convictions, and that the man at the center of it all was contesting every accusation. They waited, some attending preliminary hearings, others avoiding the courthouse altogether, knowing that the full story, or as close to the full story as the legal process could reveal, would only come out once a jury was seated and witnesses began to testify under oath. In the broader world of organized crime, the arrest sent a clear message. The federal government was willing and able to dig, literally and figuratively, into the most secret corners of their operations. Burial sites thought to be permanent silences could be uncovered. Associates thought to be unshakable could turn into witnesses. And even men whose reputations for cold efficiency had once made them seem untouchable could find themselves standing at a defense table, listening as prosecutors outlined, in clinical detail, the case that the United States intended to bring against them. In the spring of 1992, the federal courthouse in downtown Brooklyn became the stage for the final public act in a story that had played out for years in back rooms, on street corners, and in the hidden stretches of Staten Island. The case caption on the docket, United States of America v. Thomas Pitera, looked, at a glance, like any other. Federal courts handle thousands of criminal matters every year, but everyone involved knew this trial was different. Prosecutors had linked together narcotics conspiracies, a series of long unsolved disappearances, forensic discoveries from a makeshift burial ground, and the testimony of men who had spent their lives on the wrong side of the law. All of it, they argued, pointed toward the same figure, the quiet banana soldier known to the streets as Tommy Karate. Security around the courthouse reflected both the seriousness of the charges and the era's hard-earned lessons about organized crime. Metal detectors and bag searches were standard, but for high-risk trials like this one, marshals were especially vigilant. Prospective jurors filed in under the watchful eyes of deputy marshals and court security officers. Some of them had never heard of the Bonanno family. Others, particularly longtime New Yorkers, recognized the name immediately and understood that they were being asked to sit in judgment on a man alleged to be one of its most feared enforcers. During jury selection, the judge, Reina Raggi, then a rising figure on the federal bench in the Eastern District of New York, listened carefully as prospective jurors answered questions about their backgrounds and attitudes. Could they fairly weigh evidence in a case involving organized crime? Did they have relatives in law enforcement or friends who had been affected by drug addiction? Did media coverage of the Staten Island gravesite make it impossible for them to presume the defendant innocent until proven guilty? Those who admitted strong bias in either direction were excused. Others, who believed they could set aside prior impressions and follow the judge's instructions, were kept. When a jury was finally sworn in, the courtroom settled into the formal rhythm that had governed American trials for generations. The defendant, dressed in civilian clothes rather than prison garb to avoid prejudicing the panel, sat at the defense table with his attorneys. His hair was neatly kept, his posture controlled. To many in the room, he looked less like the fearsome image painted in newspaper articles and more like an austere, reserved man in his 30s. But the list of charges read aloud in court: racketeering, murder in aid of racketeering, narcotics distribution, firearms offenses, left no doubt about the gravity of what was at stake. In their opening statement, prosecutors began to assemble the narrative they would spend weeks presenting in witness testimony and documentary evidence. They described the Bonanno crime family as an ongoing criminal enterprise, part of the 5 families that had wielded power in New York's underworld for decades. Within that organization, they said, Thomas Pitera had operated as both a drug trafficker and an enforcer for hire, someone to whom others turned when they wanted a problem removed permanently. The government did not pretend that its key witnesses were upstanding citizens. On the contrary, the lead prosecutor told the jury bluntly that they would be hearing from liars, drug dealers, and killers. But he argued, criminal enterprises are not run by choir boys, and it was only by listening to those who had been inside the conspiracy that the jury could understand how it functioned. Defense counsel took a very different tack. In their own opening, they described Pitera as a disciplined martial artist who had been swept up in a storm of accusations born of desperation and self-interest. Yes, they conceded, he had known people involved in drug dealing. Yes, he had associated with members of the Bonanno family. But association, they reminded the jurors, is not the same as participation in specific crimes. They pointed squarely at the government's key cooperator, Frank Gangi, portraying him as a man willing to say whatever agents wanted to hear in exchange for leniency. Any story he told, the defense insisted, had to be viewed through the lens of his own self-preservation. Once the openings concluded, the government began calling witnesses. At first, the testimony focused on laying the foundation. Law enforcement officers who explained the structure of the Bonanno family, how crews and captains operated, and how narcotics distribution networks intersected with traditional mob rackets. They walked the jury through photographs of social clubs, surveillance images of meetings, and charts that mapped out who reported to whom. None of this directly proved that Pitera had committed murder, but it did something essential for a RICO case. It established the existence of the criminal enterprise, the framework within which the charged acts were said to have occurred. Next came the forensic evidence from Staten Island. A medical examiner and forensic anthropologist testified about the discovery of human remains in the overgrown field, explaining in careful clinical language how they had been exhumed and analyzed. They described how bones can reveal approximate age, sex, and sometimes signs of trauma, while personal effects, fragments of clothing, jewelry, dental work, helped identify specific individuals. Jurors saw photographs of the excavation sites and of cleaned, labeled remains laid out on examination tables. The prosecution was careful to avoid gratuitous detail. The aim was not to shock, but to demonstrate that these were real people, once alive, whose whereabouts had been unknown for years until the Staten Island dig. Families of some of the victims took the stand as well. Their testimony was short but emotionally charged. A sister described the last time she had seen her brother, a low-level dealer who never came home after going to meet someone about a debt. A mother spoke about a daughter who had fallen into the orbit of dealers and users, and then vanished, leaving behind only questions and a small, uncollected paycheck. These witnesses could not say who had killed their loved ones, but their stories helped anchor the case in human terms, reminding jurors that the names in the indictment were not abstractions. With that groundwork laid, the prosecution turned to its central witness, Frank Gangi. Under a heavy law enforcement escort, he was led into the courtroom and seated at the witness stand. Jurors could see, even before he opened his mouth, that he was not an outsider looking in on crime, but a man shaped by it. He admitted this from the start. Under questioning, he acknowledged his own criminal history in full, recounting years spent dealing drugs, enforcing debts, and participating in violence. Only by being honest about his own conduct, the prosecutor suggested, could he be believed when he described the actions of others. Over days of testimony, Gangi unraveled the inner workings of the drug ring he and Thomas had run, and the series of killings the government alleged were tied to it. Speaking in a restrained, sometimes flat voice, he identified individuals from photographs projected onto a screen for the jury. He explained how disputes over missing money, fears of informants, and internal banana politics had led to decisions that certain people had to go. Again and again, he placed Pitera at the center of those decisions, not as a bystander, but as the person who gave orders, devised plans, and personally carried out or supervised the acts that led to the victims' deaths. The jurors listened as he walked them through specific incidents. He spoke of a dealer who had skimmed from the drug proceeds and falsely reported being robbed. According to Gangi, when Pitera discovered the lie, he concluded that the man was not only a thief but a potential weak link who might panic and talk to authorities if pressured. Arrangements were made for a meeting, Gangi testified, and the man was never seen alive again. Later in the Staten Island field, Gangi said he had helped bury a body he believed to be that same dealer. In another account, he described a young woman connected to their operation, someone who knew where drugs were stored and who had been around key conversations. As relationships frayed, she was viewed, Gangi claimed, as a possible threat, someone who might speak to the police willingly or under coercion. When she disappeared, her family was left to speculate. Years later, remains found in the Staten Island burial site, matched through forensic work and contextual evidence, were attributed to her. Gangi testified that he had been present when Pitera disposed of her body, and that his own fear of sharing that knowledge had haunted him long before his arrest. At every step, prosecutors sought to tie his testimony to independent evidence. When he described stash apartments, agents produced utility records and lease documents showing that those locations were linked to known associates. When he spoke of specific dates, phone records often showed calls between relevant parties. And when he placed burials in particular sections of the Staten Island tract, the forensic team's maps of recovered remains matched many of his recollections. When the time came for cross-examination, the defense seized on every weakness in his account. They reminded the jury repeatedly that Gangi had cut a deal to save himself from a likely life sentence. Wasn't it true, they asked, that he hoped his cooperation would earn him a significantly reduced term? Wasn't it true that, before deciding to cooperate, he had lied to agents about his knowledge of the killings? They confronted him with prior inconsistent statements, suggesting that he tailored his story each time to fit what he thought prosecutors wanted to hear. They went further, proposing an alternative narrative, that Gangi himself was the primary killer, and that he was pinning the most serious acts on Pitera to deflect blame. They asked whether he had ever operated independently, whether he had ever ordered violence without consulting others, whether he was now conveniently exaggerating his subordinate status to appear less culpable. They suggested to the jury that the government, eager to bring down a feared mafia figure, had allowed itself to be misled by a manipulative witness. Gangi did not pretend to be innocent. He admitted, sometimes with visible discomfort, that he had participated in terrible acts and that he had kept silent for years. But he insisted that he was now telling the truth about his and Pitera's respective roles, even knowing that his cooperation would make him a marked man in the underworld for the rest of his life. Whether the jury would believe him was an open question. In the American system, credibility is ultimately a matter of juror judgment, guided by the court's instructions. Other witnesses supplemented and, in some respects, buttressed his narrative. Lower-level participants in the drug network, who had also entered cooperation agreements, described seeing Pitera in the company of specific victims shortly before they disappeared. Some spoke of conversations in which he had warned them, in general terms, about what happened to people who stole or talked. Law enforcement officers detailed the arrest at his apartment, listing the weapons, cash, and documents found inside. A ballistics expert testified about firearms seized in the case. A handwriting analyst tied notes and records to particular individuals within the crew. Throughout, the defense tried to chip away at the connections. They argued that, in a world where everyone knew everyone, mere association proved nothing. Many people, they noted, had access to the Staten Island fields. The presence of remains there did not, by itself, prove who had placed them. They pointed out that in some instances, no direct physical evidence, no fingerprints, no conclusive DNA matches, tied Pitera's hands to any particular killing. Where circumstantial evidence and testimony intersected, they urged the jury to consider whether reasonable doubt still existed. Judge Raggi played a critical role in shaping what the jury heard and how they were instructed to think about it. She ruled on objections, allowing some lines of questioning and cutting off others she deemed irrelevant or unduly prejudicial. At several points, she reminded the jurors that they must not be swayed by emotion alone, either sympathy for the victims or revulsion at the alleged crimes. The defendant, she emphasized, was to be judged only on the evidence presented, under the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She gave special instructions regarding cooperating witnesses, cautioning that their testimony should be viewed with care, given their incentives, but that it could still form the basis for conviction if the jury found it credible and sufficiently corroborated. After weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested. The defense chose not to call a large number of their own witnesses. They could have put Pitera on the stand, allowing him to deny the accusations in his own words, but that would also have opened him to cross-examination about every aspect of his life and associations. In the end, they opted to rely primarily on their cross-examination of the government's witnesses and their arguments about gaps in the case. They suggested that the government had constructed a story around a few salacious details: martial arts training, buried bodies, a dramatic nickname, while failing to present direct proof that their client had personally carried out the murders charged. Closing arguments brought the competing narratives into sharp relief. The prosecutor, speaking for the United States, walked the jury back through the pattern they had laid out: the drug operation, the internal disputes, the disappearances, the Staten Island graves, and above all, the testimony of Gangi and others who placed Pitera at the center of it all. He argued that while no single piece of evidence might be decisive in isolation, taken together they formed a coherent, compelling picture of guilt. He reminded the jurors that the victims could not speak for themselves, and that the only way their stories could be heard was through the evidence presented in court. The defense, in its summation, urged the jury to resist what they called the government's attempt to fill in gaps with speculation. They highlighted every inconsistency in witness testimony, every detail that seemed uncertain or contested. They asked the jurors to consider whether they would be comfortable sending a man to prison for the rest of his life, based largely on the word of admitted killers and drug dealers seeking leniency. Reasonable doubt, they said, was not a technicality. It was the cornerstone of the American criminal justice system. When the case finally went to the jury, the courtroom emptied of witnesses and lawyers, leaving 12 citizens alone in a deliberation room with boxes of evidence, stacks of transcripts, and binders of exhibits. No one outside that room knows exactly what was said during their discussions. Jury deliberations are sealed by design. What is known is that they deliberated carefully, reviewing testimony and asking the judge for clarifications on certain legal questions. They requested readbacks of portions of Gangi's testimony and sought to revisit some of the forensic evidence concerning the Staten Island graves. After Several days, word came that a verdict had been reached. The judge returned to the bench. Marshals brought Pitera back into the courtroom, where he took his place at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. The families of victims gathered in the gallery, some clutching tissues, others sitting rigidly upright. Members of the press filled the rows reserved for them, notebooks and sketchpads in hand. Cameras were not permitted in federal courtrooms, but artists would later render the scene in charcoal and ink. The jurors filed in, their expressions neutral, the weight of their decision evident in the set of their shoulders. The courtroom deputy rose and asked the foreperson whether the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Yes, came the reply. On the charge of racketeering, incorporating multiple predicate acts including murder and narcotics trafficking, the verdict was guilty. On charges of murder in aid of racketeering, tied to specific victims whose remains had been recovered or whose disappearances had been convincingly traced to the conspiracy, the verdict was also guilty on most counts. In total, the jury convicted Thomas Pitera of multiple murders, narcotics offenses, and related crimes that would, under federal law, carry a sentence ensuring he would never walk free again. He showed little visible reaction as the verdicts were read, his face remaining composed in the same controlled manner that had marked his demeanor throughout the trial. Some relatives of the victims wept quietly, others stared straight ahead, hands clasped. The judge thanked the jurors for their service, a service that had required them to sit through weeks of difficult testimony and to make life-altering decisions about someone they had never met before the trial. They were then dismissed, returning to their own lives, forever changed by their role in this singular case. Sentencing followed some months later, after pre-sentence reports were prepared and both sides submitted their recommendations and objections. In the interim, defense attorneys explored potential grounds for appeal, alleged errors in evidentiary rulings, questions about jury instructions, challenges to the sufficiency of the evidence. But those issues would be addressed, if at all, by appellate courts later. First, Judge Raggi would have to impose a punishment. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecution argued for the maximum penalty available under the law, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, augmented by additional fixed terms for firearms and narcotics counts. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the killings, the vulnerability of some of the victims, and the sustained, organized character of the criminal enterprise. They also noted the profound impact on the victims' families, who had endured years of uncertainty before finally learning how and where their loved ones' lives had ended. Defense counsel, aware that avoiding a life sentence was unlikely, nevertheless urged the court to consider the role of cooperating witnesses and the absence of direct physical evidence tying Pitera's hand to some of the killings. They suggested that, while the jury had spoken, the court should remain mindful of the possibility that some aspects of the case might be less clear-cut than the prosecution maintained. They did not expect leniency. Their arguments were aimed as much at setting up potential appellate issues as at influencing the sentence itself. Some family members chose to address the court directly. In measured, often halting language, they spoke about birthdays missed, holidays forever changed, and the daily ache of absence. They did not dwell on the details of how their relatives had died. Instead, they described who they had been in life, children, siblings, partners, and how their loss had reshaped entire family structures. These statements, while not formally evidence, are permitted in federal sentencing proceedings to give judges a fuller understanding of the human cost of the crimes at issue. When Judge Raggi spoke, her words were firm. She noted the jury's findings and the seriousness of the crimes, emphasizing that the case involved not spontaneous acts of violence, but a sustained pattern of calculated conduct in service of an organized crime enterprise. She acknowledged the defense's arguments, but found that the evidence supported the conclusion that Pitera had played a central, driving role in the offenses of conviction. In light of that, she pronounced a sentence of life imprisonment, plus additional consecutive terms on other counts, effectively ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life in federal custody. With that, the long arc that had begun decades earlier in a Brooklyn neighborhood, with a sickly boy discovering martial arts and a young man drifting into the orbit of organized crime, reached a legal conclusion. There would be appeals, of course. In the American system, virtually every serious conviction is reviewed by higher courts, but appeals courts rarely second-guess juries on questions of witness credibility or trial judges on discretionary evidentiary calls absent clear error. Over time, those challenges would be rejected, leaving the conviction and sentence intact. For law enforcement, the case stood as a stark example of how patient investigation, forensic science, and the often controversial use of cooperating witnesses could, together, penetrate even the most secretive corners of organized crime. For the Bonanno family and the broader underworld, it was a warning that the old assumption, that what was buried stayed buried, no longer held. For the families of the dead, it brought a measure of legal accountability, even as no verdict or sentence could restore what they had lost. And for Thomas Pitera himself, now transferred from pretrial detention to the more permanent confines of a high-security federal prison, the future narrowed to a life measured not in nighttime drives between boroughs, but in the monotonous routines of an institution built to contain men who, on the outside, had lived by their own rules. The iron door to the holding cell closed behind him, and for the first time in decades, the man who had moved almost at will across New York's boroughs found his world reduced to concrete, steel, and institutional routine. After sentencing, federal marshals transferred Thomas Pitera from the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where many pretrial detainees were housed, into the vast, mostly hidden network of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Exactly which facility he entered first is less important than the classification that would follow him. High security, based on a life sentence and a record that, according to the jury's verdict, included multiple calculated killings in aid of organized crime. Inside that system, individuality is systematically pared away. Inmates are assigned numbers, told when to eat, when to sleep, when to report for counts. For a man whose adult life had been defined by self-chosen routines, martial arts training on his own schedule, meetings arranged according to his own sense of timing, trips to Staten Island conducted in secrecy, the adjustment must have been stark. Public records do not catalog the minutiae of his days, but the broad contours are clear. He passed from the shadows of New York's underworld into the regimented anonymity of a federal penitentiary, where his notoriety mattered less than his file. On the outside, the case did not end with the slam of the cell door. In the American legal system, a conviction and sentence in a trial court are only one stage. The next is appellate review. Within weeks of sentencing, his lawyers filed a notice of appeal, asking the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit to scrutinize what had occurred in the Brooklyn courtroom. They raised a range of arguments, challenging both the fairness of the proceedings and the sufficiency of the evidence. One key issue was the government's reliance on cooperating witnesses like Frank Gangi, men who admitted to serious crimes and who hoped to reduce their own sentences by testifying against someone else. The defense maintained that such witnesses, by their nature, were unreliable. They pointed out inconsistencies in Gangi's statements over time, his clear motive to deflect blame, and the lack of independent, direct physical evidence tying Pitera to some of the alleged killings. They also contested certain evidentiary rulings by Judge Raggi, decisions about what the jury had been allowed to hear and what had been kept from them, arguing that those rulings had unfairly bolstered the government's case. In 1993, the Second Circuit issued its opinion in United States v. Pitera, upholding the conviction and sentence. The three-judge panel acknowledged the unsavory nature of the government's principal witnesses, but noted that this was almost inevitable in a case about organized crime and drug trafficking. To dismantle a criminal enterprise, the court observed, prosecutors often had no choice but to rely on testimony from those who had participated in it. The key question in the appellate court's view was not whether the witnesses were criminals, that was undisputed, but whether, in light of all the evidence and the trial judge's instructions, the jury could reasonably have found them credible. Reviewing the record, the judges concluded that it could. They pointed to the extensive corroboration of Gangi's testimony, the matches between his descriptions of burial sites and the locations where remains were actually found, the alignment between his timeline of events and independent records, such as phone logs and witness sightings, and the consistency of his account with that of other cooperators. They also rejected the argument that the trial judge had erred in admitting certain evidence about Pitera's broader conduct within the Bonanno enterprise, holding that this material was relevant to establishing the racketeering pattern and not so prejudicial as to outweigh its probative value. The appellate court's decision meant that, absent intervention by the Supreme Court, which was not forthcoming, the verdict and life sentence would stand. In legal terms, his case had moved from the volatile domain of trial testimony and jury deliberation into the more settled terrain of final judgment. For Pitera, it meant that any remaining hope of reversal through direct appeal had effectively been extinguished. Over the years that followed, he, like many long-term federal inmates, turned to post-conviction remedies. Court dockets reflect filings under 28 U.S.C. Section 2255, the statute that allows federal prisoners to challenge their convictions or sentences on constitutional grounds, ineffective assistance of counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, newly discovered evidence, or alleged violations of due process. In these petitions, he argued that his trial had been unfair, that his attorneys had failed to pursue certain leads or challenge certain testimony aggressively enough, and that the government had overreached in weaving together disparate strands of evidence into a single damning narrative. Federal judges reviewing those petitions applied a stringent standard. Under established law, a defendant seeking to overturn a conviction after it has been affirmed on appeal must show not only that his lawyer's performance was deficient in some way, but also that this deficiency likely changed the outcome of the case. In rulings handed down over the 1990s and early 2000s, district courts, and in some instances, the Second Circuit again, declined to disturb the jury's verdict. They found that many of his complaints were disagreements with strategic decisions his trial counsel had made, choices between, for example, focusing on undermining one witness versus another, rather than clear constitutional failures. They also noted that, given the weight of the evidence, there was no reasonable probability that a different approach would have led to acquittal. Beyond the formal appeals, life moved on around the case. In New York, the 1990s saw a sustained, multi-agency campaign against the city's traditional mafia families. The Bonannos, already damaged by internal betrayals and high-profile prosecutions, faced an even greater shock in 2003, when boss Joseph Massino began cooperating with the government after his own conviction on racketeering and murder charges. His decision to testify against other mob leaders, including his own underboss, marked a turning point in the modern history of American organized crime. It underscored a reality that had been implicit in Pitera's case. Even those at the top of the hierarchy, who once seemed invulnerable under the shield of omerta, could end up sitting in courtrooms describing, under oath, the inner workings of their clandestine world. From the vantage point of law enforcement, the Pitera investigation and prosecution became part of a broader narrative about the decline of the traditional American mafia. The image of agents patiently digging in Staten Island fields for human remains, guided by an insider-turned-witness, captured both the persistence of old-fashioned detective work and the increasing sophistication of forensic science. Internal training materials and seminars for new FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and homicide detectives sometimes cited the case as an example of how to approach long-buried crimes, cultivating informants carefully, corroborating their accounts wherever possible, and using physical evidence not as a standalone solution, but as one piece of a larger evidentiary puzzle. At the same time, the case fed into an ongoing public debate about the ethics and efficacy of relying on cooperating witnesses. Civil libertarians and some academics questioned whether the government's practice of offering reduced sentences to admitted killers in exchange for their testimony risked incentivizing exaggeration or fabrication. They pointed to the obvious power imbalance and to the psychological pressures on defendants facing the prospect of dying in prison. Supporters of the approach countered that, without such deals, many complex conspiracies would be all but impossible to penetrate. In the Pitera case, they argued the sheer volume of independent evidence supporting key aspects of Gangster's story validated the government's strategy. While these debates unfolded, the story of Tommy Karate seeped into the wider culture. True crime authors, drawn to the stark contrasts in his biography, the sickly Brooklyn child turned disciplined martial artist turned convicted mob killer, began to retell his life in book form. Perhaps the most prominent was Philip Carlo, The Butcher, Anatomy of a Mafia Psychopath, published in 2009, which devoted hundreds of pages to reconstructing his upbringing, training, crimes, and trial. Carlo relied heavily on court transcripts, law enforcement interviews, and the accounts of cooperating witnesses. He also, according to his own statements, sought input from Pitera himself through correspondence. The book painted a lurid portrait, emphasizing the coldness and calculation that prosecutors had described in court. It also ventured beyond the strict confines of trial evidence, floating estimates of his possible victim count that went well beyond the 7 murders for which he had been convicted. Some readers and reviewers found the narrative compelling. Others criticized it as sensationalized, arguing that by framing him as a near-mythic figure of underworld violence, it risked lending a perverse aura of notoriety. Law enforcement professionals familiar with the case were often careful to distinguish between what could be proven in court and what remained, in their view, informed speculation. Television followed. Documentary series devoted to organized crime and high-profile investigations, programs such as Mobsters, The FBI Files, and others in that vein, produced episodes on the case. Retired agents and prosecutors sat for on-camera interviews, describing the painstaking work that had gone into building the indictment. They spoke about long nights reviewing surveillance logs, the moral complexity of negotiating with cooperating witnesses, and the unsettling experience of walking through fields on Staten Island knowing, even before the first shovel hit dirt, that they were likely standing atop unmarked graves. These televised retellings often emphasized the dramatic arc of the investigation, the hushed rumors about a martial arts-trained killer, the revelation of the burial site, the tense courtroom testimony. Yet responsible producers also threaded in the voices of victims' relatives and community members, reminding viewers that the story was not just about law enforcement triumph or criminal infamy, but about the lives cut short and the families who had lived for years without answers. Meanwhile, inside the federal prison system, Pitera's life settled into an institutional rhythm measured not in headlines, but in count times, commissary lists, and the routines of a man serving a sentence with no fixed end. Bureau of Prisons records confirm that he has remained in custody continuously since his conviction, housed in facilities appropriate to his security classification. Like others in his situation, his world contracted to the small circle of people he encountered behind bars, fellow inmates, corrections officers, medical staff, and on occasion, outside lawyers or relatives who might visit. Over the years, scattered reports have suggested that he continued to maintain his physical discipline as best he could within the constraints of confinement, performing calisthenics, stretching, practicing forms in limited spaces. Such details, where documented, reinforce a consistent thread that runs through his life, an intense focus on controlling his body and his immediate environment. But the context had changed. sharply. Whatever personal routines he adhered to, they now unfolded entirely within a structure designed to contain and neutralize the threats that men like him had once posed on the outside. The people whose loved ones had died because of his actions, or the actions of the network he helped sustain, lived with longer shadows. Some, after the trial, tried to put the case behind them, focusing on work, raising children, finding some semblance of normal life. Others remained engaged, tracking his appeals, reading any new article or book that mentioned his name, sometimes writing to prosecutors or victim advocacy groups to express their continuing grief, or to object to any portrayal they felt romanticized or trivialized the harm that had been done. When The Butcher and various television episodes were released, some relatives publicly criticized what they saw as an overemphasis on the killer's personality and a relative underemphasis on the humanity of those he had harmed. In the neighborhoods where he had once moved, parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, the landscape changed with time. Old social clubs closed or transformed into other businesses as organized crime's visible footprint shrank under sustained law enforcement pressure. Younger generations, growing up amid different economic and cultural pressures, had less direct experience with the old mafia presence. Yet older residents still remembered the days when certain corners were controlled by men whose names never appeared on mailboxes, and when fears about crossing the wrong person could shape everyday decisions. For some of them, the arrest and conviction of figures like Pitera symbolized a belated reckoning with that era. Academics studying organized crime and criminal justice drew on the case as well. Scholars analyzing the use of RICO statutes cited the Pitera prosecution as an illustration of how racketeering frameworks could encompass both economic crimes and acts of lethal violence within a single conspiracy charge. Researchers writing about no-body homicides, cases brought even when remains had not yet been recovered, pointed to the early stages of the investigation, when certain charges were considered based primarily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Others, interested in forensic archaeology, examined the Staten Island dig as an example of how methodical excavation of suspected clandestine graves could yield admissible, persuasive evidence decades after the fact. For all these outside perspectives, one element remained unchanged: the basic, uncontested fact that, regardless of how many murders he committed or ordered beyond those proven in court, the crimes established at trial were more than sufficient to justify his permanent removal from free society under existing law. Advocates of tough sentencing policies for violent, organized crime offenders often pointed to his life term as a necessary deterrent and a statement of collective moral condemnation. Critics of mass incarceration, while generally focusing on less extreme cases, still occasionally mentioned figures like him in discussions about the proper scope of lifelong confinement, arguing that even when punishment is fully deserved, societies must grapple with what it means to warehouse people indefinitely. From time to time, his name resurfaced in legal filings that had little chance of success, but nonetheless had to be processed. In the 2010s and early 2020s, as debates raged over compassionate release and sentence reductions for older inmates, some prisoners serving life terms sought relief on health or humanitarian grounds. Court dockets do not show any successful effort of that kind in his case. Judges reviewing such motions when they are filed weigh not only age and medical condition, but also the nature of the original offense. In a case like his, where the underlying conduct involved multiple intentional killings as part of an organized crime conspiracy, the balance has consistently tipped away from any consideration of leniency. In the end, his story is inseparable from the particular historical moment that shaped it. He came of age in a New York where traditional mafia structures still exerted real power in certain neighborhoods, where the rise of the drug trade created both enormous profit opportunities and lethal risk, and where law enforcement was only beginning to develop the tools, legal, technological, and organizational, that would later be brought fully to bear against groups like the Bonanno family. His transformation from frail child to disciplined martial artist, then to a feared enforcer, unfolded against a backdrop of urban decline, cultural fascination with violence, and institutional blind spots. It is tempting, in retrospect, to search for a simple lesson in that trajectory. That early victimization can curdle into devastating aggression. That discipline without an ethical framework can become a tool of destruction. That environments saturated with criminal opportunity exert a powerful gravitational pull on those who grow up within them. All of those statements contain some truth, but none can fully account for why one person, faced with a particular set of circumstances, chooses a path that leads to secret graves and a life sentence, while another, in similar conditions, does not. What the record does make clear is that his skills and choices, once yoked to the machinery of organized crime, magnified harm on a scale that reverberated far beyond his own life. The Staten Island field, the funerals held years after the actual deaths, the courtroom where relatives spoke through tears, the prison where he now passes his days, these are the enduring markers of that history. They stand as reminders that beneath the abstractions of organized crime and law enforcement success are individuals whose lives were transformed, sometimes ended, by the decisions of a man whose name once passed in whispers as Tommy Karate, and whose story now resides in the public record as a cautionary chapter in the long, fraught relationship between American cities and the underworlds that grow within them. By the time the calendar turned to a new century, the sensational headlines that had once surrounded his trial were fading. New York had moved on to other stories: financial booms and busts, changing neighborhoods, new waves of crime and enforcement. Yet in the institutional memory of the city's law enforcement community, and in the quieter conversations of families who had lost loved ones, the name Thomas Pitera remained a fixed point, a reference for how far a single person's choices, when amplified by a powerful criminal structure, could reach. Inside the federal prison system, the years accumulated with a regularity that had nothing to do with the outside world's cycles of attention. The routines of confinement, counts, meals, work assignments, limited recreation, continued regardless of who sat in the White House or what new crime dramas aired on television. In that unchanging environment, distinctions that seemed enormous on the street, like the difference between a feared Bonanno enforcer and a regional gang member, blurred into the sameness of green uniforms and inmate numbers. Guards and fellow prisoners knew of his case. Some had read about the Staten Island graves or heard stories from colleagues. But in the day-to-day functioning of a penitentiary, notoriety bought little. Order was maintained by institutional rules, not by the shadow hierarchies of the outside underworld. As he aged behind bars, the world that had formed him altered almost beyond recognition. The New York of the 1970s and 1980s, with its graffiti-covered subways, near bankruptcy, and openly visible mafia hangouts, became a subject of nostalgia and analysis rather than a current reality. The Bonanno family, once a core pillar in that underworld, weakened significantly under the cumulative weight of prosecutions. After Pitera's conviction, more trials followed. Capos and soldiers were charged with gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and murder. Some went to trial and were convicted. Others pled guilty to avoid harsher sentences. A few, like Massino at the top of the pyramid, made the once unthinkable choice to cooperate. When Massino began speaking to the government in the early 2000s, he offered a panoramic view of the Bonanno organization that few outsiders had ever enjoyed. His testimony and debriefings helped convict Vincent "Vinny Gorgeous" Bassiano, among others, and filled in historical gaps about internal disputes and killings. Though much of his information concerned events and actors distinct from Pitera's specific crew, the broad outline he drew confirmed what investigators had long believed, that the Bonannos had, by the 1980s, fully embraced narcotics as a revenue stream despite old-world rhetoric about drugs being off-limits, and that enforcement within the family could be harsh and unforgiving. For scholars studying organized crime, the stories told by Massino and other high-level cooperators fleshed out the context in which Pitera had operated. They helped clarify how decisions filtered downward, from bosses and captains to soldiers and associates, and then into the everyday interactions of drug crews and street-level operatives. They showed how a man like him could become both a tool and a symbol. A tool, because his particular skills were useful for intimidating or eliminating perceived threats, and a symbol, because his reputation itself served as a warning to those tempted to cross the line. In academic and policy circles, his case also became part of a wider conversation about the intersection of the war on drugs, organized crime, and mass incarceration. Critics of the punitive policies that had swept the United States in the 1980s and 1990s often pointed to nonviolent drug offenders serving long sentences as evidence of excessive punishment. At the same time, even those critics frequently carved out exceptions for figures like Pitera, whose offenses involved multiple homicides linked to a broader criminal enterprise. Their cases were invoked as examples of why, even in a reformed system, societies would likely still reserve the harshest penalties for a small group of offenders deemed most dangerous. The shift in the public conversation about crime was mirrored in changing media portrayals. The 1970s had given audiences The Godfather and other works that, however critically, contributed to a romanticized image of the mafia. In later decades, series like The Soprano complicated that image, showing mob life as a mix of banality, dysfunction, and brutality. Against this backdrop, documentary treatments of real cases like Pitera's served, in part, as a counterweight to glamorization. By focusing on the meticulous work of detectives and the grief of victims' families, filmmakers sought to anchor their narratives in consequence rather than spectacle. Yet there was no denying that a certain fascination clung to figures like him. The combination of martial arts training, underworld connections, and clandestine burial sites was the sort of material that true crime producers and writers found hard to resist. Cable channels dedicated hours of programming to retelling the story. Paperback editions of books about him were displayed alongside other works promising to reveal the real mafia, or inside the mind of a killer. These portrayals rarely strayed far from the established record, but they tended to emphasize vivid details and psychological speculation, making him into a kind of archetype, the disciplined, emotionally detached enforcer. That emphasis led some commentators to apply labels more familiar from discussions of serial killers than from traditional mafia cases. The word psychopath appeared in book subtitles and television scripts, usually drawing on popular understandings of the term rather than formal clinical assessment. Authors and hosts pointed to his apparent lack of remorse at trial, his methodical approach to violence, and his ability to compartmentalize as signs of an abnormal personality. Criminologists, more cautious by training, often noted that while these traits aligned with certain diagnostic criteria, there was no public record of a comprehensive forensic psychological evaluation addressing the question. The serial killer label was similarly debated. In classic criminological terms, serial killers are often defined by a pattern of multiple murders committed over time, with cooling-off periods between events, driven by psychological or emotional compulsions rather than instrumental motives. Organized crime murders, by contrast, are typically gang or profit-motivated, aimed at controlling territory, enforcing discipline, or removing perceived threats. Pitera's alleged victim count. His personal involvement in planning and carrying out killings, and his careful concealment of bodies all seem to overlap these categories uncomfortably. Some analysts placed him at the intersection of the two, someone who operated within a mob framework, but whose methods and apparent detachment resembled those of more idiosyncratic killers. However one classified him, what remained constant in serious discussions was a focus on the concrete realities of his conduct, rather than the mystique that sometimes gathered around his nickname. Prosecutors, retired agents, and victim advocates repeatedly stressed that the important numbers were not speculative body counts, but the names and faces attached to confirmed or credibly alleged crimes. Each of those names represented a life that had interacted in specific ways with the criminal economy he helped run. A dealer who skimmed from the drug proceeds, an associate thought to be talking, a companion who knew too much. The patterns of their disappearances mapped onto the same geography and timeline, reinforcing the sense that this was not random but systematic. In Staten Island, the transformation of that geography over time offered a quiet metaphor for the city's shifting relationship with its own underworld history. The overgrown field where agents had once unearthed shallow graves did not remain frozen in time. Municipal development, environmental restoration projects, and changing land use priorities gradually altered the landscape. Some sections were cleaned up, others were fenced off. Nearby parcels were repurposed. Residents walking dogs or jogging along improved paths in the 2000s and 2010s might pass within sight of areas that, 2 decades earlier, had been crime scenes, with no obvious indicator of what the ground had once concealed. Local memory, however, persisted. Longtime Staten Islanders told newer arrivals about that case when the subject of organized crime came up. Parents whose children had been small in the early 1990s remembered the uneasy conversations about explaining, in age-appropriate terms, why police and federal agents had been digging in an unremarkable piece of land. Teachers and neighborhood leaders, when discussing civic responsibilities with teenagers, sometimes referred to the story as a reminder that the line between ordinary life and serious crime can be uncomfortably thin in some communities. Within the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices, the Pitera investigation and prosecution took on a kind of case study status. New agents learned about it not as a legend, but as a portfolio. The timeline of intelligence gathering, the development of probable cause for the Staten Island search, the management of cooperating witnesses, the strategies used in presenting complex evidence to a jury. Internal presentations emphasized the importance of patience, how years could pass between the first whisper of a name and the moment when sufficient evidence existed to proceed. They also underscored the need for corroboration when dealing with cooperators, whose credibility would inevitably be attacked at trial. The case influenced, in subtle ways, how later investigations approached suspected clandestine graves linked to organized crime or other conspiracies. Forensic specialists refined protocols for excavating and documenting such sites, knowing that defense attorneys would probe every step for potential contamination or error. Prosecutors became more adept at weaving physical evidence with narrative accounts, presenting jurors with a coherent sequence rather than a jumble of technical details. The Staten Island field, in this sense, was not just a physical location, but a laboratory where practices were tested and later applied elsewhere. At the same time, reflecting on the investigation also highlighted enduring limitations. For every body recovered and every victim identified, there were others, across the wider landscape of organized crime and drug violence, whose fates remained unresolved. Agents who had worked the case spoke candidly in later interviews about the frustration of knowing, or strongly suspecting, that additional crimes had been committed by the same network, but lacking the specific evidence needed to bring those acts into court. The threshold for criminal conviction, especially in capital or life sentence cases, is deliberately high. Suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not enough. These unresolved threads fed into broader discussions about historical justice, how societies should treat suspected but unproven crimes from past decades, particularly when potential witnesses have died, memories have faded, and physical evidence may no longer exist. In some countries, truth commissions or official inquiries have attempted to address such gaps. In the American context, where criminal prosecutions are the primary vehicle for official condemnation, many cases like those circling around Pitera's career simply remain as partially illuminated stories in investigative files, never fully resolved in court. For those closest to the violence, relatives of victims and people who had been on the fringes of the drug trade without directly participating in it, the years after the trial brought their own forms of adjustment. Some found ways to channel their experiences into advocacy, working with anti-violence or addiction support organizations, speaking in schools, or simply offering informal support to others going through similar losses. Others preferred quiet, carrying their memories in more private ways, avoiding media accounts or new books that might reopen old wounds. Occasionally, one or another family member would speak to a journalist writing a retrospective piece on the case. Their quotes, though brief, tended to cut through the layers of narrative accreted by law enforcement reports and true crime retellings. They remembered not a victim, but a specific person, a brother who loved a particular baseball team, a daughter who had once talked about going back to school, a friend who told bad jokes. For them, the fact that the person responsible, or one of the people responsible, was spending life in prison did not erase anniversaries or empty chairs at family gatherings. Justice, as the courts defined it, had been served, but the life stories interrupted by his actions remained forever incomplete. On the other side of the equation, those who had known Pitera in his youth or early adulthood sometimes grappled with a different kind of cognitive dissonance. Neighbors who remembered the quiet, asthmatic child, or the intensely focused young man practicing karate in a small Brooklyn dojo, had to reconcile those images with the courtroom depictions of a man who had methodically taken lives. Some, speaking anonymously or under changed names, admitted to journalists years later that they had seen hints of a capacity for detachment or a preoccupation with control, but had never imagined it would manifest on the scale alleged in court. Their reflections raised difficult questions about how much one can ever truly know another person, and about where the line lies between typical youthful intensity and dangerous obsession. Many communities have stories of kids who were different, more solitary, more fixated on certain interests, who grew up to lead entirely ordinary lives. In such cases, any retrospective reading of childhood behavior as a warning sign would be unfair. Yet when a person like Pitera emerges from that kind of background to become a convicted multiple murderer, it is perhaps inevitable that people will revisit their memories in search of signs they might have missed. In the wider historical record, his story sits at the junction of several major currents in late 20th century American life. It is, in part, a story about the rise and adaptation of organized crime, how traditional mafia structures responded to the drug economy, how they used both old-world codes and modern tools, and how they were eventually constrained by evolving law enforcement tactics. It is also a story about urban conditions in a particular era, the decline and partial rebirth of New York City, the ways in which economic dislocation and public service failures can create space for illicit economies to flourish. Equally, it is a story about the reach and limits of individual agency. The environment in which he grew up, in a working-class Brooklyn neighborhood with visible mob influence and limited opportunities, shaped his options but did not predetermine his path. Many of his contemporaries chose different routes: trades, small businesses, legitimate professions. His decision to focus obsessively on martial arts could have led into coaching, competition, or security work confined to lawful boundaries. That it instead became a component of a criminal career underscores the importance of the specific choices he made and the particular people he chose to align himself with. As of the 2020s, he remains where the justice system placed him, in federal custody, serving a life sentence. Age has inevitably altered him as it alters everyone, The man in his late 60s or early 70s behind prison walls is far removed, physically and temporally, from the young adult who left Brooklyn for Japan or the hardened figure who strode through banana social clubs in the 1980s. Any occasional letters he has sent to authors or acquaintances, contesting aspects of his portrayal or asserting his own version of events, are penned from a position of constrained power. Whatever influence he once wielded through reputation or fear has been reduced to whatever impact his name still has in books, documentaries, and classroom discussions. In that sense, the final arbiter of his legacy is not him, nor any one prosecutor or author, but the collective record. Court transcripts, appellate opinions, law enforcement reports, journalistic investigations, and academic analyses together form the composite through which future generations will view his life. That record is imperfect, as all historical records are, shaped by the perspectives and incentives of those who contributed to it. But it is also robust enough to support certain clear conclusions, that he rose from a marginal youth to occupy a central role in a deadly criminal network, that he used his self-discipline and physical training not to build something constructive, but to make himself a more efficient instrument of harm, and that the institutions of law and community, however belatedly and imperfectly, converged to stop him. What remains, then, is less a question of whether his story is extraordinary. By many measures, it is, and more a question of what it reveals about the conditions that allowed it to unfold. In the lives of the people whose paths intersected with his, willingly or unwillingly, we can see both the fragility of individual safety in the face of organized violence and the eventual grinding ability of institutions to respond. That tension between vulnerability and resilience, between the capacity to harm and the capacity to hold harm accountable, is the backdrop against which his life must ultimately be understood. On certain evenings in present-day New York, when the light falls just right across the brick and concrete, it is possible to look down a Brooklyn side street or across a patch of Staten Island brush and see, in outline, the city that shaped him. The old social clubs may be gone or turned into cafes. The vacant lots may host new townhouses or community gardens. The graffiti-scarred subway cars of the 1970s have been replaced by cleaner trains. But for those who lived through the years when drug crews and mob factions contested the same territory, the physical changes can feel like a thin layer laid over a deeper, more complicated memory. Many of the detectives, agents, and prosecutors who worked the case have long since retired. Some moved out of the city, others stayed, watching neighborhoods they once patrolled become more expensive, more crowded, less overtly controlled by any single underground group. When they are asked about the investigation that led to the conviction of Thomas Pitera, they tend not to dwell on the sensational elements that have attracted popular attention: the martial arts background, the nickname, the burial ground. Instead, they talk about the grind, the hours spent reading through wiretap transcripts for one usable phrase, the patient cultivation of informants, the bureaucratic battles over resources, the stress of knowing that a wrong step could cost a witness his life or a case its footing. For them, one of the trial's enduring lessons is that even the most carefully guarded criminal reputation can be pierced if institutions are given time, legal tools, and political will. In the 1960s and early 1970s, before RICO and before the federal judiciary fully embraced long sentences for organized crime figures, a man like Pitera might have cycled in and out of custody on lesser charges, insulated by layers of intermediaries and community silence. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, that ecosystem had changed. The same government that had once struggled to infiltrate the outer ring of the five families could now indict bosses, captains, and specialist enforcers in a single sweeping case. That shift did not happen in isolation. It was the product of multiple historical strands converging, a political climate that demanded firm responses to crime, legal innovations like RICO, advances in forensic science, and the willingness of some criminals, from low-level dealers to full-fledged bosses, to violate the code of silence in exchange for their own survival. The Staten Island dig, captured in news photographs as a tableau of crime scene tape and methodical excavation, embodied these changes in a single image, the state literally unearthing what the underworld had buried. At the center of that image, at least in the public imagination, stands the figure of the convicted killer whose choices made such an operation necessary. Yet within the prison system, his individuality is hemmed in by rules and routines. High-security federal penitentiaries are designed to reduce threat and unpredictability. Activities are scheduled, movements monitored, privileges strictly controlled. Whatever space he has carved out for personal habits, exercise in a recreation yard, reading, occasional correspondence, exists within a framework that does not particularly care about who he once was on the streets of Brooklyn. From time to time, journalists or authors have reached out, directly or indirectly, seeking his own account of his life. Some have reported receiving letters in which he disputes aspects of the narrative built around him, contesting the reliability of witnesses, minimizing his role in certain events, or arguing that prosecutors inflated their claims to secure a conviction. In this, he is not unique. Many men serving life sentences for serious crimes insist that the story told in court and repeated in the media is incomplete, distorted, or outright false. The criminal justice system itself acknowledges that trials are imperfect reconstructions, constrained by rules of evidence, human memory, and the fallibility of all participants. But in his case, as in others, the law has already made its judgment about the weight of competing versions. Multiple levels of review, trial, direct appeal, post-conviction motions have concluded that the evidence presented in that Brooklyn courtroom met the standard required for conviction. That does not mean every detail offered by every witness was flawless. Few trials, especially those involving sprawling conspiracies, can claim that. It does mean that when judges examined the record as a whole, they found the core allegations, that he played a central role in a narcotics-fueled racketeering enterprise, and in a series of calculated killings tied to that enterprise, supported strongly enough to withstand both legal and factual challenges. Outside those legal forms, public perceptions are shaped as much by storytelling as by court transcripts. True crime books and documentaries have become a major part of the cultural landscape, promising to take viewers and readers inside notorious cases. With that promise comes responsibility. When producers and writers pick up a story like his, they face choices about what to emphasize, what to omit, and how to balance narrative tension with factual restraint. Focusing too heavily on the figure of the killer risks turning him into a dark celebrity. Focusing exclusively on procedural details can make it difficult for audiences to grasp the human cost. Some of the more thoughtful works about his case attempt to walk that line by centering the voices of those who bore the consequences of his actions. Mothers who talk about the years when they did not know whether to hope their child was still alive. Siblings who recall the moment a detective knocked on the door with news from the medical examiner's office. Acquaintances who wrestle with guilt over having introduced a loved one to the circle of people who would eventually bring them harm. These voices shift the frame away from the mystique of the underworld and back toward the question that ultimately matters most. What did this person's choices do to other people's lives? At the same time, there is value in understanding the structural context without excusing the individual. His trajectory intersects with broader themes that continue to shape public policy debates. The concentration of organized crime in marginalized communities, the ways in which illicit economies offer money and status where legitimate opportunities are scarce, the challenges of policing close-knit neighborhoods where witnesses fear retaliation, and the long tail of trauma that violence leaves behind. When historians and criminologists sift through the documents related to his case, they are often less interested in him as a unique personality than as a node in these larger systems. In this light, the fascination with the Tommy Karate nickname can be seen as a kind of shorthand for something more complex. On one level, it denotes the unusual convergence of formal martial arts training with organized crime enforcement, an intersection that captured public imagination because it seemed to echo fictional tropes. On another level, it symbolizes the way that traits often praised in other contexts, discipline, physical control, strategic thinking, can be twisted when detached from ethical constraints and embedded in an environment that rewards intimidation and harm. Consider, for example, how martial arts are framed in most settings, as tools for self-defense, physical health, and mental focus. In dojos and gyms around the world, instructors stress respect, restraint, and responsibility. For many students, especially those who begin training after experiencing bullying or vulnerability, these practices become pathways to confidence and constructive self-control. The divergence in his story, where similar training undergirded a career in violent crime, underscores a difficult truth. Techniques and disciplines are morally neutral. It is the purposes to which people put them, and the norms enforced by their communities, that determine whether they become protective or destructive. That interplay between personal choice and environment runs like a thread through every chapter of his life. The Brooklyn of his youth did not dictate that he would one day help run a drug network and participate in killings. It did, however, shape the menu of options he perceived as available and the kinds of role models he saw. The Japan of his early adulthood did not dictate that he would later use his training for harm. It did foster habits of focus and hierarchy that, transplanted into a criminal context, made him more effective in that world. The Bonanno family did not create his underlying dispositions. It channeled them into an apparatus that could magnify their impact. The legal system's response, in turn, reflects both the power and the limits of institutional action. Authorities could not intervene meaningfully when he was an isolated teenager obsessed with martial arts. At that stage, he had not yet committed crimes that brought him within their purview. Once he became part of an organized crime network and evidence linked him to specific offenses, the system was capable, albeit slowly and at significant cost, of investigating, prosecuting, and incapacitating him. What it could not do was undo the harms already done or fully address the underlying social conditions that had made his rise possible. These limitations are visible not only in his case, but in many others that occupy headlines for a season, and then recede into the background hum of criminal justice statistics. For every high-profile mob enforcer whose activities are eventually cataloged in painstaking detail, there are countless smaller actors whose stories never make it into books or documentaries. Neighborhoods most affected by cycles of drug violence and organized crime often experience law enforcement as a series of intermittent crackdowns rather than as a steady, preventative presence. Residents may feel that they are alternately ignored and targeted, but rarely partners in crafting solutions. Looking back across the decades since his arrest, it is possible to see modest progress on some fronts. Community policing initiatives, violence interruption programs, and local organizations working on addiction and reentry have, in some places, opened channels that did not exist in the era when his crimes occurred. Information flows more readily, if imperfectly, between residents and authorities. Younger people growing up in the same neighborhoods he once walked have access to different role models and different pathways, from youth sports and arts programs to better resourced schools. At the same time, new forms of organized criminal activity have emerged as old ones receded. Street gangs, transnational cartels, cyber-enabled fraud rings, all have in their own ways taken advantage of vulnerabilities in social and legal systems. The tools honed in cases like his, use of cooperating witnesses, forensic reconstruction of events, complex conspiracy charges, remain relevant but must be adapted to new circumstances. In that continuum, his prosecution is not an isolated triumph, but one node in an ongoing, never fully finished effort to check the most dangerous expressions of organized violence. For those telling his story now, in classrooms, documentaries, or public forums, a central challenge is resisting the pull of inevitability. It is easy, in retrospect, to read his path as a straight line. Sickly child becomes obsessed with fighting, travels abroad to train, returns hardened, gravitates toward the mob, becomes a feared killer, is brought down by the law. But this neat arc papers over the contingencies and crossroads that were present at every stage. There were moments when a different mentor, a different friendship, or a different opportunity might have nudged him away from the underworld's orbit. Recognizing that contingency does not absolve him of responsibility. It does, however, remind us that similar trajectories can sometimes be interrupted earlier for others, if institutions and communities are attentive. In this sense, his life is both a warning and, paradoxically, a source of cautious hope. It warns of how far a person can go when self-discipline is severed from empathy and harnessed to a system that rewards ruthlessness. It also demonstrates that, even when harm has been done on a large scale, and for many years, societies are not powerless. Investigative persistence, legal reform, and community courage can eventually surface truths that seem destined to remain hidden. Imagine, for a moment, that Staten Island field as it existed at 3 different points in time. In the 1980s, under cover of darkness, it was a place of concealment, chosen precisely because no one was supposed to look too closely at what happened there. In the early 1990s, under the midday sun and the watchful eyes of law enforcement teams, it became a site of revelation, yielding up remains that told stories long suppressed. In the decades since, as the land has been altered, it is, to casual passers-by, just another patch of urban green, a place where the past is invisible unless someone takes the time to point it out. The same could be said of certain corners of Brooklyn where he once lived and worked. A storefront that housed a social club has become a restaurant. An apartment building where drugs were stashed now contains families unconnected to that history. Children walk past on their way to school, unaware that their parents' generation once spoke in hushed tones about a man whose name was invoked as a threat. Whether that forgetting is a loss or a gift depends on perspective. For those who suffered through that era, there may be relief in seeing daily life freed from its shadow. For those who study history, there is a duty to remember enough to understand, without allowing memory to curdle into myth. In the end, the figure at the center of this story sits in a federal cell, aging as all people do, his world bounded by walls and schedules. Whatever else might be said about him, his background, his abilities, his contested motives, the broad outline is fixed. He chose, over and over, to align his considerable discipline and focus with a criminal enterprise that inflicted lasting harm. The institutions of law, after years of effort, responded by removing him from the community he had helped endanger. The city moved on. New generations grew up. The Staten Island ground healed over. Yet in court records, investigative files, and the memories of those who lived through it, the story remains. It is a story not only of one man's descent into notoriety, but of a particular era's collision between old-world organized crime and new-world law enforcement, between personal ambition and communal cost. Told carefully, it offers not thrills but insight into how violence embeds itself in the fabric of a place, and how, slowly and imperfectly, that fabric can be rewoven. For a long-form documentary, closing on this note is not about assigning the last word to him, or to the agents who pursued him, or even to the judge who sentenced him. It is about recognizing that his life, like the lives he helped cut short, unfolded within systems and choices that are still with us. The fear that once hung in the air of certain New York neighborhoods has largely lifted, but the conditions that allowed that fear to take root, economic precarity, social fragmentation, the allure of illicit power, have not vanished. Understanding the history of figures like Thomas Pitera is one way of keeping those conditions in view, so that future generations might be better equipped to address them before they harden into the kind of reality that ends. For some, in unmarked graves, and for others, in a prison cell from which the outside world can only ever be remembered, not re-entered.